And we are live with the ReExamination show. Really great to have him here. Okay, first have to do several things that are like homework stuff that we have to get to. So let me take care of some of that stuff. All right. First thing, one of our most treasured family and community members on this channel is Janice, who is today 95 years old. So if you could please put in the comments, happy birthday, Janice. I would really appreciate that because Janice is probably watching. And as you know, she's had a lot of health issues lately. But at 95, she's doing really, really well. But if anyone wants to put in the chat, happy birthday, Janice. If you're watching this video later on, please feel free to comment, happy birthday, Janice. I'm sure that she would really love that. So as many happy birthday Janices as you want to put in the comments as you can, that would be really great. All right, homework issue number 2. If you have not already subscribed to the ReExamination show, it is a fantastic channel. He's a really brilliant debater. He's debated almost every big person on some very high levels. He did a fantastic, very compelling job debating the Trinity, which I think it could have been a very challenging debate. And he came out with a really strong showing. And I don't even think it was a particularly close debate. So if you've not already clicked on the ReExamination show, please make sure that you do that now. And I'm actually going to put that link in the chat and I'll put it on the screen as he's introducing himself. But stop what you're doing right now. If you have to like even leave this live stream to click on his channel, I would suggest doing that because he's got a really fantastic channel. So I'm copying the link right now and I'm putting it in the chat. I think, how many subscribers are you at right now?
233 last I checked.
Yeah, you should really be over 1,000. And so
thank you.
Here is, I'll also, oh, let me mute this. I will also pin your channel so that people can see the message.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Because stop what you're doing right now. You should definitely be over 1,000 subs. You do a really great job of all the stuff that you do. All right. Thank you all for saying happy birthday to Janice. I really appreciate that. Last thing, and I'm going to be really brief about it, and then I'll stop talking for a while so we can introduce a really fantastic argument. I crossed over to 1,000 subs last night. I'm really like floored and very humbled by that. And I had a bit of I would say I'm less theologically non-committed now. So I will give a shout out to On Day 3 and who would like me to say live, loud, and proud, and I will say it, as sure as I am of anything that I've ever said in my life, I am sure that Jesus is Lord. Now that's a new transition for me, but I appreciate you all holding my feet to the fire. I appreciate those who have prayed for me. And all right, that's all I'll say. Thank you for getting me to 1,000 subs. We'll do a special video where I can say more extensively thanks to all of you. And for now, I will turn it over to ReExamination show and let him introduce his fantastic argument.
Well, hey, I'm even closer now.
Yeah, there you go.
Hi, ReExamination show, aka Patrick Finnegan. Would love to present to you my triage argument. It stands for truth, rational, imperative argument for God's existence. It starts with normativity. It has a transcendental core. It has an abductive structure after that, and then it lands into a third stage, which is more of a near deductive process. And that's for argument 1. That would be the secular speed run. And then argument 2 is a little more purely abductive, and that would be the religion speed run, where I would take the same ideas from normativity itself and then run them through all the possible religions through like a 9x9 criteria that starts that way, but also has to do ultimately with how normativity works in the real world and if it's coherent in any other religious system. I've focused a lot on argument 1 because I'm more aware of the atheist world than I am of the religious world. And so argument 2 definitely, I would say, needs a bit more shoring up, but it still has some interesting aspects to it. Argument 1 I've spent the most time on. I think it's the most fun. I think it's the most particularly interesting. Let's bring the slides up, Tavo.
Okay, here's the slideshow.
Right. All right. So triage, truth, rational, imperative argument for God's existence. philosophical case for the Christian God. If you see any mistakes, it was Claude. We'll put it that way. So yeah, we got argument 1, argument 2, and we have an ontological extension, which I just unceremoniously sprung upon Tavo. Don't blame him for that. Blame me for being overly enthusiastic and just keeping on. Hey, Robin, we are here to critique. Yes, and I'm here to get critiqued because it's only worth it to get all the wrong ideas out of your head, right? I think that's one thing we can all agree on here on this show.
For sure. Well said.
Thank you. Argument 1, secular speedrun, establishes transcendent necessary personal ground of normative authority through the structure of rational discourse itself. Argument 2, the religion speedrun identifies the ground as the God, the Bible, and strict double imputation as the only mechanism satisfying both justice and forgiveness. Ontological extension is an emerging argument that the same personal ground that obliges recognition of reality must also have jurisdiction over what reality is, like the law of identity, also having to do with normativity.
Can you rephrase those 3 arguments in words that are going to be more accessible to a wider breadth of some of the people who may be watching?
Yeah, I guess it takes a moron to just kind of say things the way I said them. Okay, so argument 1 basically is like, here's my argument against atheism. I think that if you're going to have rules to life, like reason and logic, that it's going to have to come from a personal ground that could actually obligate us to do those things. And same thing with morality. So that we got 2 tiers, or at least 2 dimensions of normativity, which would be morality, how we ought to behave, and then epistemic, meaning how we ought to think, normativity. So normativity is this idea of, just the rules of engagement in life that we could otherwise violate. It's possible to violate these rules, but they still exist regardless of the fact that we violate them. Is that better?
Yeah, I think that's a nice summary of it that brings it down. And now argument number 2.
Yeah, so argument number 2, we just look at all the different religions and which of them are historically backed, internally coherent, which one of them actually maps onto our experience in real life, and especially from an angle of, do the rules in these religions actually reflect the way that reality works and how humans actually live? And then the ontological extension is this idea of like, okay, so there's telling us what we ought to do, how we ought to think, and then there's a separate discipline of like just saying what a thing is. Like telling me how I ought to do something is not the same thing as like being specific about what a thing is. So if I say an apple is an apple, I might be obligated to believe that an apple is an apple, but that's a separate question of what is an apple. And my this is kind of new and I'm developing it, but my contention is the same mind that obligates us on how to live and think is the one that assigns identities to things and makes things what they are. So, I think there's a necessary relationship between those two, and it might take a bit to be established. Let me know if that's clear, because I think I can be really opaque. Even the word opaque.
No, I
can
think
be really
that's
unclear.
That's much clearer. There are some people with more like rudimentary theological vantage points, myself included, on this channel. So I think that like crystallized it well.
Great. All right. Something you already know. You cannot argue against God without treating logic and truth as genuinely binding on minds. So let's just take the position that normativity exists. A lot of atheists believe in logic and reason. I mean, for the most part, there's very few that I've run into that don't. But let's take something like morality. I think every day we understand. I mean, look at the example. Someone lied to you. If you look at the leftmost square, lying has to do with information. So it could be seen as epistemic, or it could be seen as like a knowledge claim. Some knowledge claims are merely like 2 + 2 is 4 or something like that. But if I say 2 + 2 is 5, that is a failure of a standard of how we ought to think in terms of logic and mathematics. But if someone lies to you, it might be a similar action of them making mouth noises, but it's not that they just said something false, but they lied. There is a moral weight tied to it, something they said that was genuinely wrong. And that's less so much of a failure of some kind of logical formula or mathematical formula. That actually takes into account our accountability for our lives, and that we have genuine moral guilt and genuine fault, even though physically maybe the same thing happened as if they said the truth. They're saying things either way, but something is actually different and meaningfully about those 2 things. you saw an injustice. Just name any injustice. I'm sure there aren't many fans out there of let's just say Donald Trump, and then you will immediately feel that visceral reaction, and then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, and I won't need to go much further. But it's not just a preference violated, something that should not have happened. Actually, really wrong. Now, even to say should is to make an ought claim, or some kind of claim that instead of what happened, instead of the person's choices, happening, they should have chosen the opposite or something different. There's a responsibility norm that they have violated that everybody should follow. And then on the opposite side of that, you would say you forgave someone. Now, there's a difference between injustice and then forgiveness. Forgiveness is you have the wronged party and they are volunteering of themselves to take the hit, take the cost of what you've done, and let it go. And that would not be equated to corruption. That would not be equated to complicity in most cases. There would be an actual moral debt, shall we say, that people voluntarily let go, and it would not contradict justice. Now, what kind of reality constitutes that? That's my question. And of course, let me know if you have any questions or anything you want me to clarify on the way, because
No, well, I mean, several people are already commenting, mostly Dr. Curt, but who I'm really glad is here. But several people are commenting, isn't this just the tag argument? So that's probably just so you preempt that question.
Yeah.
We've talked about this. This is sort of in a similar family to the tag argument, but just something to keep in mind as you go through the next few slides. But one of the things that I liked in the document is you established this slide really kind of capitulates that there are binding rules that we sort of agree to implicitly when we have a conversation and somebody says, this is true, or you should believe this, or you should believe this because it's true. And that suggests that there are normative binding rules that exist that we're all agreeing to, but they're sort of like the air that we breathe. They're so common and they're so implicit that they're essentially invisible to us in some contexts.
Yeah. So to address allegations, the tag argument, this starts with normativity. So if you want, the tag starts with the God of the Bible. Now, I'm a Christian and I do have personal presuppositions about the God of the Bible, but that's outside of the argument that I'm presenting right now. What I'm presenting right now starts with normativity and asks the question, what's a better explanation for the existence of normativity in the first place? And I think it could be reasonably argued for that God is the necessary precondition for that. But outside of that, you could just start with normativity itself, because it's already agreed upon between secularists and theists, widely at least. I'm not sure aware of anybody who isn't. I mean, we'll get into that later. But if you say that it is just tag, then if anything, you've just conceded the debate, because if normativity equals God of the Bible, then that's pretty much the argument right there, because that's tag's starting point and ending point. So I would caution against doing that. Go ahead, Tavo.
No, well said. And I won't interrupt too many more times, but I will say that we're going to go till about 5:45, and then I'll put the link in the chat where people can join and come up and ask questions themselves. So if you're chomping on the bit to ask questions like, isn't this just tag, or it is just tag, and here's why, we will have an open forum part of the conversation as well. So I know there's a lot of slides to get through, so that's probably going to be it for me for a while.
Yeah, and I'm not even watching. I'm not even watching chat right now. I'm kind of focused on this. Actually, you know what, Tavo? If you want, we could throw up that first slide to give an example of triage in action, just a small sample, so in case anybody thinks that like a trained atheist couldn't spot tag a mile away.
Okay, let me remove this and then bring this up.
No, the video, the first short from the private chat.
Oh, okay, all right. Let me share that then.
Apologies, I'm kind of throwing you all over the place. Should have started with the short.
All right, here, all right, good. So I'm sharing this now. This is the short that you're referring to, right?
Yeah, the Dillahunty one.
Okay.
Oh, do you want me to do it?
Oh, people should be able to see the screen right now.
It's interesting because I don't see it on my screen. But if you want, I can throw it up on a different tab.
Hold on. Let me pause the video. So it should be it's playing, and I think I'm sharing the screen, so I think people are hearing. So we only see you two. Okay, let me try again. Let me try and stop screen. Let's do this.
Okay. They
Okay,
don't
and
see a screen. Here, you
let me
want me
try
to do
to
it?
share my screen again. Share screen and entire screen. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, are you seeing this
No.
on stream? You're still not seeing it, really. It's showing up to me on StreamYard. All right.
Well, yeah, that's fine.
this
We'll go
may
back
be
to the
my fault.
slideshow. We'll go back to the slideshow, and then we'll take all the other material off, and then we'll worry about that later.
Okay, all right. I apologize. Yeah, or if you want, you can share it. That should be okay too. But
it's saying stop screen for me for some reason, and that might be in reference to the slideshow. Let's just go back to the slideshow.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Let me add this back to the stage.
Yeah. All right. So.
Oh, the missing mod is saying I have to add it to the stage in addition to sharing it. I could try again, but if you want to just stick to the slides, I think that's fine with me.
Yeah, let's stick to the slides, and then we'll show it. We'll show a few videos in action later, because
Gotcha,
I actually discussed this with a few atheists who would either if they would recognize tag if it were tag, because you can smell tag a while away. A Christian can smell tag a mile away. So central question, these demands press against you whether you like them or not. They persist through your refusal to acknowledge them. They exist before you arrived. So you didn't choose to be born. You didn't choose who your parents were. You don't choose reality you get put into. And you also don't choose what normativity is. You don't choose what logic is. You don't get your own right to a private reason or a private, morality and things like that. And you just get to stab people to death. No, but so the question here, what makes these demands genuinely binding rather than merely preferred, right? So if they're merely preferred, then it's just a description of phenomena. It's just people walking around. It's easy to imagine a universe where there's people and there's things and they're interacting with each other, but there's no rules to it. It's just matter in motion, as, Bonson would say. I'm not pretending that Bonson's not there in the whole thing, but it doesn't start with the God of the Bible. It starts with normativity, a thing that everybody agrees exists. So it's not why we have them. Evolution, meaning that, you get installments over time from your ancestors that contribute to what you already think. And then it doesn't come to upbringing and a culture. These are things that are transcendent. These are cross culture. It's not like you go to a different country and then they have 18 laws of logic and you have 3. And but what makes ignoring evidence a genuine failure rather than just a different choice? That's the question. So we have, in any philosophical position, we have the law of identity to say, if you want to use normativity, the rules to say, my position is this specific thing, none other. Therefore, you have to recognize what I'm saying when I give you my position. Don't strawman me. The law of non-contradiction, my position is not its contrary, and both cannot be affirmed at once. And then normative binding force, as in this is correct and you ought to accept it. Failure is genuine epistemic error, at least. And, who knows, maybe in some cases you could probably think of moral wrong, but not mere preference. So there is an argument here starting, and this isn't the main syllogism I was telling Tacos about, but it's a chain here. Every argument uses normative binding force. Normative binding force is genuine normative direction, meaning it discriminates from any other direction except where it's going, and it's going because of necessity of truth in that, as long as we're using logic and reason correctly. Genuine normative direction requires a goal structure. We're supposed to be reaching a conclusion with our reason. Goals require holders. You cannot have an impersonal, mindless goal. Goals, even the idea of goals is like an abstraction. And then you would have to have a personal source in order for that mind in the first place, because if you have a goal, you would have an idea, you would have an intention. An intention comes from ideas come from minds come from persons. And so every argument uses normative binding force. We have that, again, the near transcendental aspect to this. Without normative binding force, a position is not an argument, it's a conditional, a structural observation carrying no claim on anyone's assent. If I say a rock is just laying over there, that's not a command on your life. And this includes every argument, against this argument. So in order to argue against it, you have to say, I ought not believe what I'm believing right now. I ought to believe something else. And that reason itself carries you along to do that. Reality itself carries you along to do that. Every contestation of every step that follows, every critical demand that argument justifies itself further with, the act of reading this and evaluating whether or not it's correct, these all employ normative binding force. So to argue against it is to work on the same wavelength that I'm working on, which is just normativity. I ought, for example, if I say, should we have creationism in schools? Most atheists are just going to say no, and they're going to have reasons, and those reasons are going to make value claims, and those value claims and all the above need to be established based on their worldview. That's not just new. I mean, if this was just tag, then atheists would have nothing to say amongst each other about what makes a value claim or what makes any. You wouldn't have alternating theories about ontology and epistemology and normativity, all these sorts of things. So I'm just engaging where you're at. Normative binding force to goal structure. Normative binding force is genuine normative direction. It presses against individual goals with prescriptive force. Sometimes what is logical goes against your personal goal. It persists through non-recognition. You can violate them without knowing that. It generates genuine fault for non-compliance. If you steal from somebody, you are in a guilty state. It points in a defined direction regardless of preference. So, for example, let's say you think that my argument is wrong. What you're telling me is logic is binding me and pointing me in a direction away from this argument. So I don't really see a way out of this. Step 3, direction requires a goal structure. So I think that the term goalless direction is kind of the married bachelor of secularism, in the sense of like, well, we have these directions, we have normativity, and normativity just arises from, sui generis or some kind of Kantian theory or some kind of evolutionary communal state. And in that case, it just is. It's just there. Well, then that just kind of boils down to descriptiveness, unless there was an actual purpose to us. But a purpose would need to come from an intent would need to come from a mind, and mind would need to come from a person. So ultimately, you have a goalless direction where you posit there's a direction, but a goalless direction is just movement. It's just displacement without orientation. It's incoherent as a married bachelor, and so
it's velocity without a vector.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
If you were V for Vendetta, that would be a great line. All right, to expand on this, goals require holders. We are humans. We make goals all the time. I've only ever known persons to make goals. And so if you want to say that the normative binding force of the universe has goals, then how does that not come from a mind? That would be an interesting conversation. Human goals cannot be self-generated. What I mean by that is you cannot make your own ontology. You cannot remake normativity to suit yourself. It is over you. The agent did not choose the goal-forming structure they used to form goals. Goals cannot be reduced to behavioral descriptions. Genuine failure to achieve a goal while performing the behavioral pattern shows they are distinct, right? So if you say maybe there is a God and it's possible for you to make choices that go against his rules and go against what he has designed for us, and then the fact that those are recognized as broken regardless of how many times we break them, and they still exist, that would suggest that there is a goal beyond us. That would suggest that the value claims that exist regardless of our behaviors and our faults and our crimes and our actions, that would come from a goal that wasn't begun by us and not instantiated by us, because our goals would be different, but both would be directional. So it goes to the cosmic goal argument: a not resisting all individual goals, pressing against every agent, persisting through all non-recognition, serves a goal no individual holds. The direction of that resistance is the fingerprint of the intent. And so you look at the reverse watchmaker. Now, usually what happens is people will call into atheist shows and say, they'll give the watchmaker argument. You go into a forest, you see a painting, there's a painter. You see a building, there's a builder. And then atheists will say, okay, so, but the problem is I've never seen a universe maker. We see people making paintings and making watches all the time, but we don't see people making universes. And I can just step back from that and say, fair enough. But we only see persons categorically obligating other people. We only see these sort of things with law or with rights or with appeals to responsibility, where people are obligating each other on that. But we have not seen in any category an impersonal thing obligating somebody else. So it wouldn't be the same thing as a complexity argument. It would be an argument from principle, which is totally different. So I would have to implement the reverse watchmaker on those who would say otherwise. So the personal source, usually AI generates it as T for the transcendental goal holder, the basis of normativity. The goal holder is a personal source by definition. Intentionality, directedness towards objects as such.
And I'm sorry, I have reviewed the argument in these slides, but what does the T stand for here?
I'm thinking it's the conclusion, as in the personal source of normativity. Like
gotcha.
Go ahead.
What does the T? What does the T stand for? Just
I'm thinking it's transcendental.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's just I just roll with it because I know what it means. I just let throw it out there. Yeah. So mental is analytically personal because mental would be the basis of intentionality. You can't say that nature has intentionality without either using some kind of reification or loose terminology. So T must be necessary. Contingent sources cannot ground necessary normative direction, meaning that T has to be foundational to reality itself. And contingent would mean like dependent upon that thing that like you and I are contingent. We rely upon reality as it is to exist and survive and all those sorts of things. It has to be universal, meaning, all over the place. The ought to bind all rational agents everywhere. A finite source cannot ground universal scope. This is not me saying that rocks are morally accountable. I'm talking about persons. This has to do with persons specifically. It's not saying that the mouse here is like morally accountable. Truth and goodness as its nature. Obviously, goodness would be a standard. Badness would not be the standard by which to achieve badness would be a failure of an existent standard. Truth and goodness would have to be the standard by which we measure proper behavior and proper thought. All right. Now, I'd have to go into a slideshow, but I have 14 different defeaters of impersonal normativity. Usually these have to do with things people call brute facts. And I'm definitely looking forward to critiques on these. I'm going to have to show us some slides before long to characterize some of these, because I do have slides for each individual brute fact defeater, but I'll just go through these as quickly as I can. So for those of you who don't know, a brute fact is something where a secularist will say, this just is a thing of a universe. Morality just is a thing. It's just all there is to it. There is no explanation. But the problem is, the problem with that being posed is, number one, in the relata category, relata meaning have to do with a relationship. Like, what is the relationship between a human and a brute fact, which is just a mere denial of any future explanation of a phenomenon or a thing. Number one, it would be no standing. So basically a negative explanation, or sorry, a negation of explanation doesn't have a cognition, doesn't have a brain, doesn't have any creative power or any creative ownership over me. So it wouldn't have any relationship so as to make me at fault for doing something morally wrong, or a standard by which I ought to think so as to make me epistemically or logically wrong. No second personal address, meaning that it can't accuse me of anything. I'm actually second personal. I have to read more of Stephen Darwall's work on that, but basically it doesn't have any accusatory power.
Let me rephrase where you're at in the argument, just so people are on the same page with us, because it is a complex argument. But you've so far shown that normativity ought to come from a personal entity, or a personal like entity, I could say. And now these are refuters of arguments that say that no, normativity can come from an impersonal source. So this is kind of where in the pro-catalepsis sort of part of the discussion, where we say these are the ways that you could get normativity without a personal source, and you're going to go through each of them, defeating them.
Right. I wish I knew what pro-catalepsis meant, but hopefully I
was like anticipating the argument and saying like, here's the, and again, just so people know, we are going to open it up in about 15 minutes after we get through more of the argument, so that people can come up and ask questions. But I really want you to lay the groundwork for the argument first. All right, go on.
Yeah. So no capacity to be wronged. You cannot commit a crime against a brute fact. It's just an abstraction. No capacity to hold or release claims, meaning it cannot hold you accountable. It cannot forgive you either. Rebellion, asymmetry, failure. So rebellion. So for example, it seems weird that, I'd have to probably look back at the slides, but it seems weird that it would be a brute fact that it would have to be a brute fact that there is a standard, and also a brute fact that you can violate the standard. And so those brute facts would both simultaneously exist in the universe without canceling each other out. And I think that's probably what I was driving at with that, but I'd have to look back at my notes. Another category is directionality. We already went over the goalless direction incoherence. And then differential moral scope failure. That's another thing I have to look at my notes for, to be honest. I've been kind of doing tons of research to prepare for this, so I'll have to get back to that. So grounding, this one's interesting. So brute stop as normative act. What that means is somebody tells you morality is real, it's just a brute fact. But the problem with that is now we need a brute fact to make me obligated to believe that brute fact and then just stop explaining things. But I need justification for why I ought to accept why that's a brute fact and why I have to stop looking for further explanations. Number two, the value map double bind. Again, this makes me want to go back to my slides. So the value map double bind, I think, has to do with because I know forgiveness and incoherence comes later.
Well, I know, and there's 14 things here. So if you want to highlight some of them that you think would be illustrative, I think that's fine too. Because I know it is a complex argument.
Yeah. Here, let me. I have to check my notes here when it comes to.
And I'm also happy to add the other notes to the stage.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd have to check that one later. Anyway, so Megazord is interesting because going through AI, I'm like, well, look, what if we just granted all of the brute facts that you want, just as many as you want, put them all together, and then put them aside against the God of the Bible. We'll have like a face-off. What ought exists that I ought to accept this Megazord, this huge entire construct of brute facts that mimic God in every way, versus an actual God. And then the problem is, because God has aseity, meaning that God sustains himself, affirms himself, justifies himself, and necessitates himself by his very nature, the Megazord of brute facts is unconscious and not even personal, so it can't even do that. It's just a negation of an explanation. And based on parsimony, and also based on the idea that the nature of the Megazord cannot affirm itself, you would have to go with God rather than the Megazord. The bottom fact is cell wall. So that comes at the idea of people just saying that every instance of a thing, every rock has its own identity, and within the rock is its identity of itself. And that's where the identity is located. It's not located in some transcendent truth or mind. But the problem with that is, if I say something as a fact, even on an individual level, and I'm still obligating other people to believe that each individual fact is a fact, then the normativity itself is still being asserted against me, and then require me to respond. But what about the thing itself requires me to respond? There would have to be something transcendent by fact itself, and not the individual itself, which would obligate me to believe even in individual things. It's hard to actually articulate when you try and bring it out, but I'm working on it. All right, epistemic. So I wish I had my notes here. You know what? Why don't we just? Oh gosh, let's see if I can. Let's see if I can bring up the 14.
I think you're doing great, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
And it's a complex argument, and it took me a while to reading through it. I think we can. What I'm looking forward to in the chat, while you're looking forward for your things. By the way, a lot of people have had really insightful comments in the chat. I'm just not paying as much attention to the chat as I normally would, because I really want to get all the meat of the argument in my head for the questions later. So although the chat has been very interesting and entertaining already. But I think
let's just move forward, because I think this one's probably would take most people a while to get through, and I have more slides I can just show on the stream later on my own channel. So for the sake of time, we're at 11 out of 30 and we got a few minutes left, so let's just power on.
sure, that sounds good too.
Yeah. So consumption principle. So every contestation of every step in this argument uses normative binding force in the act of contesting. By steps 1 through 5, every contestation presupposes a personal source. The contestation instantiates what it contests. So meaning that you have to use normative binding force in order to fight against it. The secular philosopher who demands more argument issues a prescriptive, meaning making a demand of me. Normative binding force is confirmed. The refuser uses unchosen cognitive goal structure to pursue the goal of refusing, using what's refused. Every fact invoked to argue against normativity already contains normative binding force as its cell wall. The brute stop ranks itself as adequate, a normative act barring what it cannot supply. So it comes down to like every secular basis for trying to bind me to a certain way of thinking and a certain way of acting is inadequate in and of itself, and it was more of a description of phenomena of the physical world than it would be anything else. So here's what I'm proposing, and this was a version of the syllogism I wanted to give to tacos, which is atheism requires the law of identity, meaning a thing is what it is, the law of non-contradiction, meaning a thing cannot be itself and not itself in the same way at the same time, and normative binding force, meaning that we are obligated to behave and think in certain ways, to identify itself as atheism and distinguish itself from theism. Premise 2, atheism cannot ground normative binding force. The genuine ought, requiring minds to recognize the distinction, requires a personal source. Atheism denies that source. Conclusion, atheism is philosophically untenable. No justified philosophical position called atheism is available. What remains is a volitional refusal, a will standing on borrowed normative authority to deny the source of that authority. So here's what that means. You've got the laws of logic, which would include what a thing is and what a thing isn't. And then atheism would say that reason binds you to identify philosophies and things as they actually are. But if they deny the grounds of that binding, or their actual way of trying to establish binding doesn't actually ground it, doesn't explain it, and makes it untenable, makes binding either unnecessary or unestablished, then even atheism itself doesn't have a definition if atheism is your grounding for philosophy. And by extension, everything else would fall under that. There would be no identity, not because of lack of knowledge, not because I'm asking, how do you know what you know, but because if normativity is gone, if the rules of life are gone, then reason itself is gone. And reason it would just be like a river following a course, which is just descriptive rather than something I ought to comply to.
This makes sense to me. Can I ask a follow-up question here?
Please.
What if the atheist retort to this is that normative binding force is only an apparent and emergent phenomenology, and that actually comes from the fact that we're just minds trying to navigate our surroundings, and we found sort of we've defined it as logic just because that's an easy and parsimonious way to do that maximizes our survival.
Yeah, that just sounds like description of behavior. If you want to say it's emergent, then it's one-to-one with the actual thing itself. But then the question is, okay, did the nature that came from that emergence have a purpose, or is it just accidental? Is it just off-gassing of matter?
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. And there's a modus tollens of the argument. If atheism were true, genuine normative binding force would have no adequate ground. Premise 2, genuine normative binding force has adequate ground, demonstrated by its ineliminability, meaning you can't get rid of it, from every attempt to deny it. Conclusion, atheism is false. So I'm just going to skip that one. And then there's so this is the ontological extension. This is under construction, but I think it's interesting. Premise 1, objective normative authority requires a personal ultimate ground from argument 1. T being that personal ground. T's authority includes an obligation for rational agents to recognize reality correctly. Premise 3, to recognize reality correctly, there must be a determinate truth about what things are. Premise 4, if determinate identity is grounded in a source, O, I'm guessing that means for ontology, independent of T, would mean for I guess the transcendental person, then T's normative jurisdiction depends on a reality whose structure T did not establish. So you would have, and the idea would be like one thing makes things what they are, and then another thing obligates you to behave accordingly. But if we have two separate things, then what binds them together? What makes them work together in the first place? So then comes premise 5. A two-source theory owes an explanation. Why does T's authority lack O's ontology? So the conclusion would be a unified personal ground of both ontology and normativity has a genuine explanatory and parsimony advantage over a two-source account. Anyway, that's not a mathematical proof, but it is something to consider before continuing to say otherwise. So from T to the God of the Bible. So that would be the secular speed run. And we're making the transition to argument 2, which would be the religion speed run. Argument 1 establishes T, transcendental. I'm going to slow down because I'm trying to keep with time. But transcendental.
No. The most important thing is getting through the arguments. So
yeah. Transcendent, necessary, personal source, whose nature is truth and goodness. Argument 2 asks 2 questions. Question 1, which tradition accurately identifies T? And question 2, what mechanism satisfies both real justice and real forgiveness without compromising either? Because if you don't have real justice, how can you claim to have normativity? How can you have a right response to something wrong that happened without justice? And then as far as forgiveness, we are looking at a world that is either some kind of trap or it's not. And we would assume that in a world where we forgive and forgiveness is real, there would be an explanatory corollary in something that is foundational, meaning that if forgiveness is real, forgiveness comes from something beyond us and is real not because we invented it, because obviously if you can commit a crime or commit a sin against somebody and that sin is real and then forgiveness isn't real, then you would have to explain, you'd have to either say forgiveness and justice are lies or they're not. And I think the secularist is in the same bind as many other religions, because if you say that either justice or forgiveness isn't real, and you want to maintain the rule that we ought to believe real things and we ought to disbelieve false things and we ought to act accordingly to real things, then if you're going to say that justice is just a convention and forgiveness is just a convention, then in order to be consistent, you have to reject both justice and forgiveness as just conventions and not real things, and you would have to live accordingly, because you can't cleanly cut your knowledge claims away from your lived convictions. Yeah, I mean, unless you want to live as a total hypocrite, which I don't think anybody can live as a 100% hypocrite, but we'll go with that. So we have the double constraint. This is kind of what I detailed before. Moral debt is answered at a fixed terminus, not deferred, not dissolved, not declared unreal by fiat, a moment at which the account is finally and actually settled. This can be in like justice, if you want to say like either jailing or the death penalty or some kind of fine. Without justice, a God who forgives by declaration tells victims their suffering was ultimately nothing, not wrong enough to require an actual answer. Both, and if I'm going to skip to the top, both must be fully preserved simultaneously, because otherwise you would have a contradiction if there is no means by which these two can coexist. That's one of the dilemmas here is, can you have real justice and real forgiveness in the same universe without them contradicting each other? Because with forgiveness, something wrong has happened, but the response is totally different than what justice would be. But forgiveness would not be injustice, because then forgiveness itself would have to receive justice. So you have to figure out in what universe that we live in right now, can justice and forgiveness coexist? If you look in the green box, we're talking about a personal creditor voluntarily releasing a real claim. So if you've ever forgiven somebody, this is what you do. Not an attitude adjustment, not cessation to consequences. The one who holds the claim actually and deliberately releases it at genuine personal cost. And without forgiveness, finite creatures under an infinite debt have no exit except consumption. Then creation becomes an entrapment mechanism, which would not be an expression of goodness. It would just be a flawed universe that is bound to fail and doomed with no point of redemption whatsoever. So I have 9 identification criteria here. These are things that are, again, I would say they are heavily borrowed from Bahnsen, if I'm being totally candid. And if you read a lot of his or listen to a lot of his lectures, he talks about some of these things, but he never formalized it into anything. He's most famous for TAG, but it has to have an objective ground of truth, meaning it can't be just this mush. It has to have a ground of determinate identity. We have to identify who God is, or what T is in this case, the personal source of this. It has to have inerrant inspired scripture, or at least have the claim of inerrant inspired scripture. One of the things Bonson points out is, well, Confucius or Buddha writes something down. Well, that's just what Confucius or Buddha says. How do I know what Confucius or Buddha says is true? And in this case, how do we know that it's binding? Ancient historical continuity, meaning that you have to have an ancient account of it. It can't just be something that was made 5 minutes ago. And the reason for that is, if it was something that was made 5 minutes ago, then it has just as much basis in human experience and human history than something that's made 5 minutes in the future, and then 10 minutes in the future. And before you know it, you have all these new religions that have no history, have no basis in humanity, and then there's no limiting principle on what could or could not be true, and it leads to confusion, because you could always have a new religion contradicting the previous 5 that were made by you and your friends and your grandma. Which goes into condition 5, forward historical reach into present, meaning that it can't be a dead religion. It can't be something that nobody follows and nobody needs and nobody has any resonance with, which goes into 6. Global resonance. It can't be like a local folk religion where it's indistinguishable from somebody's culture. It has to be, if something is true, like normativity itself, then it has to resonate with people on a universal level. Like, you have Christians in Africa, you have Christians in Armenia, you have Christians in Russia, you have Christians in Australia. If it was just something that was localized, it probably wouldn't get past all these cultural restraints. Now, cultures can, of course, inform and color the expressions of those things, but it doesn't take away from the core of what the belief is. Now, condition 7 is going to be controversial, because I have Trinitarian impersonal basis, and part of that would be going into 8, the one and the many. I might have to just consolidate those two and then just leave out the Trinitarian and go to the one and the many part. But my argument for that would be that the Trinitarian interpersonal basis is a basis for relationships between people in general. It would have to be a basis for hierarchy among equals. It would be a basis for the one and the many in that case. But again, it's not exactly key to argument 1. Argument 1 for secularists would just be the impersonal grounds are insufficient. We're in the religion realm now, so we've left that behind. And then, of course, condition 9 would be internal consistency. This is about the Islamic dilemma. Atheists and Christians alike are familiar with the Islamic dilemma, and we can just kind of move past that because we got like 10 more slides. But the idea is, if the Quran is true, then the Bible's true. And if the Bible's true, the Quran is false. But we're going to skip that part. Now, there's also moral architecture. This also needs work on my end. We need a personal ultimate ground in order to make it intelligible. We need both justice and forgiveness preserved. We need creator and creature asymmetry. It can't, it's because then if the same level of people that are sinning are the people that are establishing the record of what good and bad is, and they're justifying themselves, then there's no coherence to our moral system. We are just instantiating it and violating it, instantiating and violate. We make it and break it, make it and break it. It's just, it doesn't work. Number 4, all creaturely obedience is already owed, no surplus, meaning that if this person is God, if this person is the basis of reality, that person doesn't need anything from us. We can't, like, for example, if I look over into my neighbor's yard and I see their kid, this is going to be a little offensive, but if I see their kid over playing in their sandbox in the neighbor's yard, and I go over and I end their kid's life, and they're upset with me, and I try and give them bloody sand from the sandbox to pay back, it's like, oh, I'll pay you back. No, here you go. Well, no, not only was the person's child, the sand was already the person's sand to begin with. And the same is true with us. We cannot pay God back with anything we do. It's already owed, and it's already owned by this necessary person. Number 5, finite resources, categorically insufficient against infinite debt, which is why a sacrificial system, again, same reason, only goes so far. Again, this probably deserves consolidation and refining. Impersonal mechanisms cannot perform moral acts. yeah. So that goes back to argument one. Suitable substitute required, meaning that if we're not going to get the punishment, something else should get the punishment in order to preserve justice. Otherwise, it's just forgiveness by fiat, which is indistinguishable from injustice, which goes into 8, which would be strict double imputation, guilt to substitute, righteousness to believer, which is where we're at with Christianity and the cross, because on the cross, Jesus died bearing the sins of the world so that anybody trusts in him and his sacrifice to satisfy the wrath of God and satisfy the debt we owe to God, then his righteousness, his perfect record as God is imputed to us as individuals. And then our sin is put on him on the cross where he died, he was buried, he rose again the third day according to the scriptures. And all who trust in him, repent and believe in him will be saved. Their heart will be made new. And that goes into the gospel, and they will have a heart that leaves sin and goes to God, and gets rid of the sin that they once loved and embraces the God they once hated. And again, the ancient documentary basis, not invented post hoc. Again, I think this deserves to be cleaned up a bit, for sure. So
it's a complicated argument, but I see what you're talking about. Do you want to just kind of summarize what double imputation is for the people who haven't heard that phrasing before?
Yeah, so to impute something is basically to kind of attribute it somewhere. So if I say that if I make you the new president of my club or something like that, I've imputed you with presidency. It's been given to you, an attribute or some kind of aspect that wasn't there before. So double imputation would be where you have Christ, Jesus. He is righteous, he is holy, and he is perfect. He is the grounds of holiness altogether and the grounds of righteousness in his person. And he comes to earth in human form and bridges the gap between God and man in that way. And then but we are sinful. We are fallen. We deserve death. We deserve hell. We've broken God's law. We're made in his image. We're responsible. And so now we have that sin debt as our record and a sin nature. And so we need to be changed because we can't change ourselves. We are dead in our own sins and trespasses, as the Bible says. And what that means is we have no hope in ourselves to satisfy God. We have no hope in ourselves to earn his favor, earn his forgiveness. You can't earn forgiveness categorically anyway. But I think that forgiveness itself is genuinely a Christian only kind of thing, because all other gods do it by fiat, I would say. But double imputation, what that comes down to is our sins are imputed to Christ once we trust in his sacrifice to satisfy our sin. He came to die in our place. We deserve to die. He died for us, not only on the cross, but also in the sense that the Father's wrath for our sins was placed upon Jesus on the cross. Sorry, I'm trying to formulate this a little bit, but so that's one imputation, is our sin imputed to Christ. And then the other imputation is his righteousness, not only his righteous record, but just his position with God is imputed to us. We don't deserve it. It is a free gift. And that's the only way that we could be saved, is if justice is still maintained, being on Christ on the cross, the punishment still being given out of death and the fullness of the Father's wrath. And then also forgiveness being met there without sacrificing justice, so that we can be forgiven, knowing that this was God's plan in order to transfer the records so as to have a way that justice is satisfied, and then we are forgiven and can be with God for eternity, having peace because of Christ's sacrifice in our place. Does that help?
No, yeah, that's great. Now we are at about 53 minutes.
Yeah.
So do you want to do a
little skip and a jump?
Yeah. Why don't we skip a little bit to the ending summary, and then I'll put the link in the chat so that people can start lining up if they'd like to have a bit more of a direct chinwag with you. Yeah.
Let me see. I mean, yeah, I guess this is more like gospel stuff and arguments, and we can just skip to the end. Yeah. So what crosses the remaining distance would not be a better argument. It'd be the announcement that the creditor has already paid the debt, that the justice and mercy that the argument establishes must exist, and it has in fact been satisfied, and that the invitation is open. So yeah. Anyway, a long presentation, long argument. There are many things you did not hear. There are many things that weren't even in these slides. Tavo's aware of some of them. And yeah, let's open it up. But let's also, let me play that YouTube video too. It's only 60 seconds. So it would illustrate the kind of argument that the atheists would be encountering.
No, I think that's great. That's a great idea.
Yeah. I do have 2 more videos, but those are much longer, and we don't have to go into that because I'm sure people have lots of questions. Let's see. I guess I got to stop the screen and then share this one. Okay. And then we just have to stage it.
There you go. Okay. All right. Let me stage it there.
Yeah. I just got to take the slideshow off. And then
I have to take the slideshow off. Yeah. Let me remove that. Oops. And then I'll add this to the stage. And there we go. Now we should have it.
So would we agree that universally humans ought to believe what is true and ought not believe what is false?
No, I don't necessarily think that we ought to believe that which is true. I don't know how to justify that as an ought.
Great.
Help me understand real fast, both of you. Is the word ought thrown out as kind of a tripwire?
It's an imperative, yes.
It's an imperative. Yeah, like we ought, for example, so we would be doing what we ought not do if we say, I don't want to believe that truth. I want to believe a comforting lie. So I'm going to go back to my cult, or I'm going to blast my brains out with drugs, or any number of things. Like if we, like for example, if you say I got deconstructed or I got deconverted out of my religion because the evidence brought me out of that, then what that means is there is a prescription from truth itself that dictates the actions of people, what they ought to do and how they ought to think. That truth itself is prescriptive, absent of anybody's preferences.
Is it prescriptive or can it be descriptive?
Well, if it's descriptive, then it doesn't have an actual prescription. But for example, I could say that humans have X behavior that is, communal, but that's just a description of their behavior. That doesn't necessarily prescribe anything any more than 2 + 2 = 4, or like what the atomic number for lead is.
So that's one example.
I think that's a good example of it. Here's my question too, and I'll bring up the first person, and I'll stay on the screen as well. But and by the way, just a note, let's keep with the topics for ReEx and the triage argument. If ReEx wants to be a little more broad, I think that's probably okay. But as much as we can, let's stick to the triage argument. I don't see Dr. Curt up here yet. I was thinking he would pop up, but maybe he will later. Objective ethics is in the chat too. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on this as well. And my question for you is this: is there a way to experimentally debunk the argument? In other words, if we find that that there are black holes that are generating universes for reasons that are clearly very sterile of anything other than a materialistic process, and then if we can probe some of those universes and realize that they aren't as logically navigable as our own universe, is that something that would falsify the argument experimentally?
I don't think so. And the reason I would say that is because if we observed such a thing, it would still have normative binding on our thoughts, such as to change our mind, even in that example.
All right. Well, let's bring up Chronicle. Chronicle's been on the channel a few times, so really good to see you, Chronicle.
Hey there.
Chronicle, are you there with us? Just want to make sure. I know sometimes you have audio problems.
Oh man.
Okay, well, we lost Chronicle, but yeah. Well, let's bring up Robin, and then if anyone else wants to chat, the link should be there. I think I've got the link pinned. So, but we'll bring up Robin. Great, really great to see you as always, Robin.
No, thank you.
Hey, Robin.
You've been busy, ReEx. You've been busy.
I've been very busy. I wish I could do a better job in my presentation, but I make with what I do.
I thought you were great. I thought that it's a very for you, it's a lot to squeeze into like a 1 hour time frame, and I think you did a great job.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
I plan to do more presentations on the channel to be more exhaustive. Those will probably be like 3 hours, and people can have more to critique from what I'm saying. But I'm interested in hearing what Robin has to say. Her and I have had a few exchanges down this lane, but her and I have never really talked this deep in the triage argument because I separate argument 1 for secularists and then argument 2 for religious people.
Well, I'm not going to go into a big, like, we'll discuss it like later, but I was just going to.
Macintosh Pro is saying this is Robin's channel. I'm sub to Robin, and it's a great channel, and Robin's I would say one of the nicer people I've met in the whole community here. So yeah,
Yep.
sub to Robin's channel, please.
That's true. Go ahead, Robin.
I'm just gonna ask you for a definition.
Yeah.
Just so that way I don't take up too much time. I know there's probably other people. I want you to define a justice for me.
Yeah, justice would be the right response to moral wrongdoing.
Okay. So based, like, what would you base? I mean, like, you're basing that on whatever system you're in, like your.
Yeah. So the grounding would do. So for example, if I was a Muslim and part of one of the things that a husband in Islam can do is deny his wife sex. And in my worldview, you can't do that based on 1 Corinthians 7:1-5. And so the grounding of that would characterize the direction of a thing. And that's one of the discussions I had with Simos a couple nights ago. I had a stream with Steelborn, who, by the way, has been a contributor. I should give acknowledgments to the people who have helped made this, but it's off topic. I would say one of the things I said to Simos is the grounding gives direction to the normative binding force. So if I'm an atheist, I'm not going to pray. I'm not going to go to church. I'm not going to have Christian fellowship. I'm not going to read my Bible. But if I'm a Christian, I'm grounding everything in a Christian normative binding force grounding. Then I am going to pray. I am going to read the Bible. I'm going to go to church. I'm going to have Christian fellowship. And so it's not a question of like, is there some secular mathematical criteria for this? The grounding characterizes and gives direction and compass to everything.
Okay, so your ideal of justice would be grounded in a biblical view. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And then for our purposes, you and I, we would still be in argument 1, not argument 2. So I would have to engage on the personal source versus impersonal level if we were doing it in the triage level. But and I would be pressed to ask, what grounding would you be using to evaluate my grounding for your normative binding force?
Well, I would say that my system is like secular humanism, but like like our sense of justice that we have in the United States, where a person is responsible for their actions and they are punished according to their own actions and not the actions of others. And that's why I was asking, because we know from the Bible that there are several incidences where people are punished for the crimes of others, the sins of others. Like David's wives were punished for the actions of David. I would say that all of humanity has been actually punished for the crimes that Adam and Eve committed. And there are several more different incidences. And so I have a lot of issues with the ideal of justice from a biblical view. Yes.
Okay. So, but did you use reason or did you use sentiments? I would say. I don't know if you want to get into it or not, but if you want to let that as a statement, we don't have to have a back and forth. But if you want to, we can.
I use, like I said, I just use our modern sense of justice. That I'm convinced is convinced by the system that I think that people should be accountable for their own actions. I don't, and in the Bible, it actually says that. There are passages where God says that he will not punish people for the sins of others or the crimes of others. But then there are actions where he does do that. So
yeah, and there's also passages like Genesis 50:20 where it says what you meant for evil, God meant for good, and Romans chapter 8 where it says that God works all things according to, I think, the counsel of his will or something like that, or for his glory and our good. And so there's obviously the looking of the crime itself, and then there's looking at God's intent behind the whole thing. And so that's not an endorsement. For example, like when atheists tried to use what you meant with the whole like God using a punishment with the sexual assault of David's wives in that case, and then I would have be forced to ask, okay, so if that's true, then if we're gonna put the blame on God for that, then that would also have to be true in a secularist worldview, meaning that any prior causality to that decision making is actually to blame and not the person. But if the person doing the essay is to blame, then it's not the prior causality that's the problem. So the secularist doesn't actually get out of that either.
Well, not all secularists are don't hope. Some secularists hope ideal free will. Is that what you're talking about? Like,
Right.
like,
Then the person would be at fault and not any prior
just
causality.
yeah, just because we're an atheist doesn't mean that we don't believe in free will. Because I mean, like, I don't, but there are atheists who believe we have free will too. So that, that's kind of an individual thing. That's got nothing to do with the atheist claim, actually, I guess.
Oh, that's fine. But you also know that Destiny would be an atheist, and he's a hard determinist. So in both cases, the sword cuts both ways on what you're trying to bring up for the whole David wife situation. Where if you're going to insinuate that prior causality removes agency, then that works both ways, and I don't think that you're going to actually maintain that.
Well, thank you for putting me in pile with Destiny. I appreciate that. Yeah.
I am making a differential comparison, instantiating the tiebreaker portion of the triage trifecta. By the way, the triage trifecta, whenever you're watching somebody give you a position, you would ask, what is the value claim that made you choose one position over its complete opposite? Another one is, what is the relationship between your value claim and then the rest of us that we ought to obey? And then the other would be, what was the relationship and what gives that value? That would be the third question in the triage trifecta. And usually you can run those over and over again to finally get to the nub of what their grounding is and if it's any good.
All right. Well, I won't hold you up any longer. I'll let you talk to some other people, I'm sure.
Well, Robin, let me ask you a question, which is, I'm going to try and steelman, just to crystallize this portion of the discussion. I'm going to try and steelman the triage argument and marshal it against you with a question. And that question would be like, is there a way that you can create, do you have any escape out of the normative binding force that ReEx is appealing to? In other words, ReEx is saying you have to at least submit to normative binding force. If you say, like, I shouldn't, then that you're making a claim which goes back to the normative binding force.
I really don't. I don't know that I understand what, like, I think that our shoulds probably come from our society that we live in, and I think that goes back into our into evolution so far. I know that all the other social apes, like bonobos and chimpanzees even have, and probably all the other ones do too, but I've studied them too more than the other ones, have rules in their society that, and there is an acceptable amount of punishment that is used against the person who breaks those rules. So, like, I think that we can probably ground morality in some sort of evolutionary basis, but I'm not really 100% sure about that. But I think that most of our morality comes from our societies, that once we learn to live together, we have to learn to get along, or we're not living together in a peaceful way, and that would make survival hard and difficult for people. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if I understood.
I think it does. I mean, I think the issue that ReEx would probably say is that proves that there is a normative binding force, right? If it's true in other animals, but
yeah, that's possible. I mean, that is possible.
One more thing before you go. I do live stream on this channel, like I said, every Monday, 5 p.m. Pacific time. And Robin, I would love to chat with you specifically about something on this coming Monday if you're up for it. So please try to hop on Monday and
I will. I'll try to. I've been trying to be here.
Yeah. I actually have some specific questions for you based on some stuff that we talked about last night.
Oh yeah, I'm nervous. All right.
No. And I think we always have great conversations. So it's not going to be anything that
All right. Thanks. Good job, ReEx. I'm sure that you'll have tougher criticisms than me. So. That
I will. I know there's very, very smart people out there. So
all right.
Thank you, Robin.
Let's bring up Chronicle back, because Dr. Curt is technically ahead of Chronicle, but Chronicle hopped up and then hopped off, and I know Chronicle has a lot of audio problems. So I think Chronicle will be relatively quick. Chronicle, are you there?
Hello.
Hey,
Hi, Chronicle. Just want to get to your argument, and just, I know you logged on earlier, so.
Okay. One of my friends used to do debate with Muslims in Hindi only, but he never talked to a Christian in English, especially from USA. Can you invite him for a debate or conversation on the channel?
Sure, sure. I mean, I would say just tell him to come up any Monday, 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If anyone wants to schedule something with me outside of that, you can also just email me. My email address is on my channel. But I would love to chat with them. Yeah, I'd love that. We have a panel coming up, a panel discussion on this very channel, where we're going to be talking about Islam and just kind of a real, honest talk about Islam with no preconceived ideas. So
Okay.
I'm really looking forward to that.
I think I can talk to them on Islam.
Yeah, I'd love that. Yeah. Do you have any questions for ReEx?
He's a Muslim or a Christian?
Christian.
ReEx is a Christian.
Okay, you are a Christian. No, I don't have. There are many questions, but topic is only about Islam, so I cannot ask him.
Sure.
Sure, no problem. You've joined a couple of times, Chronicles, so I'm always happy to chat with you. I'm always happy to have you on the channel. If you do you want to if there's no other questions you'd like to ask, you can think of another question, or we can bring up Dr. Curt next.
Okay, if you want to invite someone else, invite them.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, but Chronicle, please come up any Monday, 5 p.m. We're always happy to chat with you. And anytime I'm on, you're also welcome to ask me questions. All right, let's bring up Dr. Curt then. If you don't have any other questions for the guest Chronicle, I'll bring up Dr. Curt.
Hey, Curt.
Hey there, how you doing?
Yeah, there we go. Great to see you, Dr. Curt.
I'm doing good. Very nice presentation in terms of like the amount of work you put into it.
Thank you.
You spent a lot of time thinking about it.
Thank you for the nice words.
I do want to get into like basically this lands or falls on the meaning of the word normative, right?
Yeah.
All right. So where do you see that word deriving from? Like, how do you view it?
Deriving from. So
like it comes from the word normal, right?
I know it's related to the word normal.
Yeah. So do you think normal is not like generally a statistical concept?
There are, in my mind, there are two kinds of normal. The normal that is an average normal in terms of like a population's average behavior, average accepted conduct. And then in Christianity, I mean, this isn't a theological term that anybody uses, but I think there's a normal in terms of sound thinking, sound living that is objective, independent of cultural norms.
And I know
so
normal,
you're saying that normative doesn't
right?
mean normal in the sense that you're using it here.
I'm saying normative as a transcendental, not normative. I'm not saying normative as in like we all wear a certain kind of sneakers and we speak a certain language.
So this normative is free of norms.
I don't know what that means.
Well, norms are based on what's normal.
Okay. Again, I have with the normal understanding I'm talking about is like, for example, laws of logic. Like the very dialectic you're using right now is not based on your culture. It's not based on your genetics. It's based on something that triangulates the two of us to hold us to a standard of thinking. And that's what you're using right now. I'm appealing to what you are using right now in order to question
I'm
my
actually using
definition.
Language though, right? I'm using language.
You're using language. You're using language as a medium to communicate a standard that transcends us.
Okay, well, that's a great question. So when we are going to determine the meaning of a word,
yeah,
do we use like normative concepts like you're describing from Christianity, or do we use statistical norms?
Again, I have two separate definitions for normal. I laid them out, and I'm giving you the transcendental one for this one. I'm not saying that because it's normal in America to speak English, therefore the normative law is to speak English like the laws of logic.
Right.
So this kind of sounds like this kind of sounds like when Vosh was having the debate about trans people, and he said, "Well, it's called water here, but south of the border, it's called agua." Well, that's just not substantial to the argument here.
No. That's I'm not making an argument about translation. I'm making an argument about where the concepts that you're using within your Christian normativity get their like meaning derived from. Are you saying they don't derive their meaning from language? They derive it from some other source?
I'm a little confused, because to say deriving from language presupposes a logic to it, doesn't it?
Does it?
Does, I mean, otherwise you have
vervet monkeys.
Otherwise,
Okay,
you would have
so when vervet monkeys
to have some kind of syntax, to have some kind of conveyed meaning, like we would use a language as a medium to convey meaning, right? Does that mean that until language was invented, there was no meaning?
Well, first of all, language wasn't invented.
Normal can also mean perpendicular.
Yeah, that's correct.
Describe that to me. When you say perpendicular, I'm thinking like this.
Oh yeah, no, that's what it means. 90 degrees.
Yeah.
Geometrically, that would be a normal angle.
Right.
Okay.
So, okay, you're familiar with vervet calls, right?
Verdant cause?
Vervet calls.
No.
So vervet monkeys, there are boreal monkeys.
Vervet monkeys. Okay.
Yeah, and they have several different calls that are understood syntactically by the other monkeys. Mm-hmm. One signifies a snake, one signifies a bird of prey, one can signify food being somewhere. Do you think that the vervet monkeys have norms?
I think they have behaviors that are constituted in something that's real, but to say do they have norms? Let's put it this way. I don't think that gray areas erase bright lines. So even if we find animals with a language, that doesn't actually do anything for my argument, because it would just say that they're independent of vervet and monkey calls. The laws of logic still exist and would have to be dealt with as such.
Okay, but that's just assertion. What I'm asking is, do they require the laws of logic for their calls to have meaning?
In order for this to just an assertion, you're saying I need to justify my claims, which begs the question of normativity in the first place.
I don't get how that is assuming the consequence.
Because in order for you to use a criteria by which to affirm or deny somebody's position, you would need to make a value claim to do that. So you would have to, number one, do what Dillahunty didn't do, which was ground why I ought to believe true things and not believe false things. And we haven't even established that yet. I'm just kind of granting you stuff for the conversation.
I'm just asking you about monkeys and what's going on when they use a call. I'm not
yes, because that is a means to draw a question into what I'm saying when I say norms. So that's what's going on. And so I'm addressing it as such.
Because, well, so what I'm suggesting is that these vervets have like socially conditioned sets of calls that have like a meaning out in the real world, right? Don't they?
Right. So they have meaning in the real world. I agree that there is communication with meaning in the real world, and that can happen with animals, and that also happens with humans.
Okay. So great. Right. No. Okay. Wonderful. Now we agree that meaning in the real world can exist in a creature that cannot describe formalized laws of logic.
I would say that how do I put this? I would say that reality necessitates your conformity to it, which is a normative reality in the first place. So, for example, when I said to Matt Dillahunty that there is a prescriptive aspect of reality, which is necessary for you to even ask this line of questioning in the first place. For me to even accept that is for me to make a value claim that what you're saying is true and that I ought to believe true things, which is the thing in question that we're kind of like not even addressing. And so to talk about how, hey, monkeys also recognize reality and have a logic that is understood based on what is real in order to conform themselves to it, it doesn't actually bring into question my understanding of normativity.
I mean, it seems like you're kind of filibustering the point here, but I'll move on. Do you think then that the vervet monkeys have like a genuine referent to the sound that they make when they see a snake, or is it determined as a statistical norm from like the calls of the group? Like that there's like an averaging that takes place within the minds of the monkeys that then gets ascribed within this particular parameter range. That means snake. Within a separate parameter range, it means bird of prey.
Yeah, I think that things are real and recognized and perceived, and even if things are mistaken, that would be let's say something. Let's say the monkeys thought that something was a snake that wasn't a snake. They would still have a mode of communication in that sense, but the communication would be a real communication, and it would have but it would have but it would have something to do with something that's real in the first place. But again, I could. Even if I granted you your entire line of questioning on vervet monkeys, it wouldn't touch my argument.
Well, my question is not specifically about vervet monkeys. It's about whether they use statistical norms to determine the meaning of their speeches, right? And
yeah.
Your statement about them like messing with one another is actually correct. They will occasionally, just to get some extra food, call snake and have everybody run away, and then they'll go grab the food that they know there's not a snake there for. And so what we see is, like, to me, that seems to be a statistically, like, socially normatized behavior that's based on statistics and not on anything separate from the existence of those monkeys, right?
Yeah, in order to have statistics, you have to have probabilities. In order to have probabilities, you have to have a fixed point. In order to recognize a fixed point, then rationality would have to be real and constant in order to affirm that fixed point and be conscious of it in order to make your model in the first place.
So what you're saying is that happens all entirely subconsciously without any knowledge of that process taking place within those monkeys, then, right?
I can't speak for the psychology of monkeys, but I'm talking about normativity, the same thing we're using to have this.
Well, you certainly think that a toddler or like a grade schooler has these things, and that's happening within them in the same way that it would happen in a monkey without their conscious awareness of all the words you just used.
I mean, I digest without a conscious awareness of muscles and
Correct.
things working.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Right. So this process doesn't require any kind of assent to a proposition for it to be effective, is my point.
Yeah, I thought that was your point. I think that's a logical leap, because you wouldn't have a prescription by which you would fail a reason. For example, this entire conversation is predicated upon reason being a real thing. It's not just even if you wanted to say it's a means to an end. Like, hold on.
Well, when you tell me what I think, that seems unfair.
It's implied by what you're saying. If I'm talking to you through a telephone, I'm not lying. If I lie to you through a telephone, I'm not lying to the telephone. I'm lying to a person. That's a genuine moral failure in that case, right? So just because there is a means by which things are understood, that doesn't mean that the means are the thing doing the understanding or the instantiation of the norm. So we have reality in of itself, being that it is. We only understand reality from unreality and distinguish those two and make value claims so as to make evaluations in order to guide our thoughts. Your entire line of questioning is trying to parse and separate. I'm not lying. I'm lying to the telephone, right? The entire line of your question is not. The entire line of your questioning is not. Hey, let's have a normative behavioral statistical discussion. Your line of questioning is, perhaps your notions are mistaken. That's the entire line of questioning. So you might say, oh, you're mind reading or you're putting words in my mouth, but that's what it is.
Okay, so I'm just trying to sort out then. Two toddlers are in a grade school, and one toddler kicks the other toddler.
Yep.
And the other toddler is then angry and says, you shouldn't have done that.
Okay. We have talking toddlers, but yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think many toddlers can talk. Many toddlers are quite fluent. Most speech begins at like 1.5 years, 2 years, right?
Yeah. I'm parentally ignorant. We'll put it that way. So go ahead.
So the one toddler is telling the other toddler that. Do you think that toddler who is like getting upset about being kicked has a fully developed sense of the laws of logic?
I'm not saying you have to have a PhD or anything or fully developed in the laws of logic. I'm saying these norms are existent regardless of our knowledge of them. In fact, that was in my presentation.
Right. That's exactly what I just said you disagreed with. I said you can have these without assent to any propositions.
Okay, that's not the same thing. There's an unconscious adherence to it, and then there's like actual cognitive awareness. Those are two different things. So you going to like, well, you can have these without an assent to anything. I don't accept that.
So you think the toddler is assenting to a proposition when they say you shouldn't have kicked me?
Yeah, to make a shouldn't is an assent to a proposition, because then you would have a
And
standard
the
by which
toddler is
shouldn't would be
aware
violated.
of that sequence of thoughts.
There's
Can
a
I-
different.
Can I try to can I try to interject?
Go ahead.
By the way, I did get a call from the birthday girl. So she's 95 years old and a good friend of the channel. So if you didn't hear that at the beginning of the conversation, please feel free to say happy birthday to Janice, who will probably be watching either now or later. But I guess my point would be monkeys can count, toddlers can count, right? They might not understand that calculus is a direct outcome of the laws of the numbers that they're using and referring to.
Right.
Yeah, so they don't have to consciously aware that, but they're still engaging in a system that has those implications.
That pre-exists them and is independent of them.
And they need not assent to any propositions to use that system, right?
Let's even say I grant that they need an assent to them. How does that bring into question whether or not they exist? That would be interesting to hear.
Okay, so then you keep talking about genuine moral claims. Are there like moral claims that you believe are not genuine?
Oh, like maybe a moral claim that it would be immoral to teach creationism in schools because creationism is false and we ought not teach false things. We ought to only teach true things. So I would say that particular instance I would disagree with.
Okay, so you think there are moral claims that are like not genuine?
It is possible to make a false moral claim, if that's what you're getting at.
No, I'm saying a not genuine moral claim. Like the distinction, like you keep saying genuine moral claims or actual or real moral claims. And I want to know how to distinguish the genuine moral claims from claims that are not genuine.
Yeah, well, that would be in the argument two portion when we establish personhood. But I think between you and me, we haven't established personhood yet. So that would be how I would engage you. Would not be an argument two, because then you would be using an impersonal basis. I would assume, unless you have a God, which I don't think you do, you'd be using an impersonal basis by which to evaluate a personal basis. In which case, I would have to say, why are you grounding your line of questioning in? Is there a normativity?
Why would my beliefs have anything to do with the truth of your claim?
Because your grounding would be an opposition to grounding when we need a tiebreaker between those two. That's why.
No, I'm not talking about grounding at all. I'm talking about the word genuine in your sentence.
Yeah, there's granting and then there's grounding. So I can grant, but here's the thing. Once I grant something, you're going to evaluate it by your grounding, whatever your chosen grounding is. And then I'm going to, for some reason, the sake of conversation, need to submit to your grounding as the thing that I ought to give answers to. But if you don't have a personal source for your grounding, then I don't see why I owe anything to an impersonal source. As far as and if you want to say that, what do you mean by genuine? I mean, you would actually in the case of like argument two, you would actually owe something to God. You would actually belong to God, and so his allegiance would actually be belonging to him, and that's where the genuine failure comes from. You would not have genuine failure of sinning against a rock or sinning against the number 7 or sinning against the laws of logic if they were just an impersonal expression based on social norms.
So again, you're talking about a lot of stuff and you always throw a lot of stuff at me when I say something, and I'm really slow, so you're just going to have to like slow down and help me here. Imagine like two toddlers who've been kicked. And one toddler says, that was wrong, you shouldn't have done that. And the other toddler says the exact same thing, but has like a different mindset and is grounding his like being upset at being kicked in some other set of facts than the first toddler. Are they both making genuine moral claims? Or is one of them making genuine moral claims because his grounding is more correct and the other one is making a non-genuine moral claim? And how would I distinguish the two?
Yeah, so a genuine moral claim means you would have a sufficient grounding so that morality would exist in the first place, which people in the secular realm, the argument
which
won.
Which toddler would have the genuine moral claim?
Well, that's a separate issue.
What would the toddler need to have to make it genuine?
Okay, but but before I answer that question, in the scenario you're giving, you're granting the personal ground of normativity, right?
No, I'm granting nothing. I'm asking you how you understand.
Right. Okay. So, but okay, then if you're granting nothing, then are we talking about a secular point of view for these two toddlers then? Or because if you're going to
I don't have a point of view. I'm asking you about yours.
You do have a point of view. I don't think that's true either. But when you're asking me about
I don't have a point of view here. Like genuinely, with all the things you're talking about, I would adopt a stance of sort of epoche or quietism. I don't know that I have any firmly held beliefs on this idea of normative the way you're using the word anyway.
Yeah,
if it were statistical normative, I have very strong ideas about like statistical norms. I work with those all the time.
Yeah.
But your like Christian norms, I'm not sure about how they work. So that's what I'm trying to find out.
Right. Well, that's why I need to ask questions, because if you're a quietist on this, quietist is still within the framework because it has to use the law of identity and the law of non-contradiction to identify itself and differentiate itself from Christianity in the first place. So it would still be in the evaluative triage framework. It just
let me be clear. Like up until very recently, Tavo was theologically uncommitted. Are you saying that until the point that he became uncommitted, he couldn't ask you these questions?
The point of normativity is saying that even if you're not aware of it, it still binds you, and it does manifest itself in our thinking regardless. Even the rejection of it.
Wow, that's such like a weird response to what was obviously a yes or no question.
A yes or no question doesn't mean it's not a complex question that doesn't require lots of explanation to.
It's really simple. 5 weeks ago, could Tavo ask you that question and he would warrant a response?
Okay, restate your question.
Okay. When Tavo was theologically uncommitted previously, and he would ask you this question that I'm asking you now, would you not owe him a response because he was theologically uncommitted?
The question you're asking me now? Now I'm confused.
Yeah, I'm asking you which toddler has the genuine moral claim and which toddler does not.
I don't think the question is clear enough because you said they both kick each other. So I'm assuming the basic. I'm assuming the basic.
But one has different grounding than the other. I said one has different grounding than the other. How do we determine which one has the correct grounding?
I think it's a false dichotomy because you can have a different. You can have two toddlers that.
So you can't answer my question today.
No, because it's a false dichotomy. Because
could you have answered that question from Tavo 5 weeks ago?
Curt, come on. To say that one has.
You can't answer that question?
Curt, can you listen? Okay.
It's such a simple question. Like it's so weird that you won't answer.
Curt, it's so weird that you won't stop talking for me to answer. Look,
I'm the one who won't stop talking. I invite anybody to go back and listen to how much.
Well, let me interject here and then say maybe Dr. Curt, it would help if you gave more of a more details around the hypothetical. Two toddlers kick each other, right?
Why one is grounded in the fact that it hurt when he got kicked, and the other is grounded because in the fact that he went to Sunday school and they were taught that it was wrong to kick.
Okay. So are you saying that which one is claim is correct?
Does one have a genuine moral claim? Do both have a genuine moral claim? Does neither have a genuine moral claim? How do we determine which of their moral claims are genuine?
Yeah, so you would need a personal standard by which to do that, which goes into argument 2, because that personal standard would have the scripture, which would characterize the judgment by which we ought to ground that. But from an impersonal standard, you wouldn't have that. You would just have descriptors of somebody kicked somebody, and then words were exchanged, and sensory nodes went off.
So the kid who's angry because it hurt when he got kicked is not grounded on your view.
There's a difference between whether or not a genuine normative binding exists and whether or not a claim is validated within somebody's worldview. If your worldview doesn't establish something, you can, let's put it this way. You can have the wrong worldview, misidentify the source of the wrong, and misidentify the moral structure, and still be right about the wrongness of an act in your conclusion. So you can look at the hurt, and you can look at maybe, I mean, I think it's hard to say that something's wrong that because it hurt and not think that it is undeserved. But even if I grant that as part of the hypothetical, that the kid doesn't even think about how it's undeserved and only thinks about how it hurt, I would say that, I mean, per my worldview, there would still be grounds of categorically understanding wrong from unprovoked harm and hurt. I'm
Now,
just trying to
let me try and steelman Dr. Curt's argument.
okay.
If we found that bonobos had like a strong sense of morality with no theistic beliefs, would that falsify argument number 2? Would that indicate against argument number 2? Should that make us less likely to accept argument number 2? And if that doesn't falsify it, then what would falsify argument number 1?
Well, what would falsify in argument number 1 is if you have an impersonal basis that has a relationship with humans, such as to have an explanatory power for something that is not just something that could actually bind us, has a relationship with humans so as to keep them accountable to a standard and have a goal for the actual normativity in place. Because otherwise, like I pointed out in one of the early slides, it's just motion. It's just a goalless direction, all normativity and all thoughts. But as far as the bonobo thing, I mean, in my worldview, I think if God makes creatures, some creatures are going to be different expressions than others. But and we just say that they have certain reactions to things. I would say secularly that would just be descriptive. But in my worldview, there could be animals that do show things that mimic compassion because we have the same creator. But again, not all animals are like that. Some animals eat their own mothers. Some animals eat their own children. So it's kind of hard to make a statement of like 1-to-1 of each animal is like the same, or each animal should be or shouldn't be like humans. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I'm sorry to make it more complicated than it needs to be. I admit that I'm kind of
we do have
lost.
3 other people, but
I'm happy to step down.
Well,
I'm happy to step down.
Let me ask another question, because I think it'll inform both of your perspectives on this part of the conversation. If we discovered a universe that was being spun out of a black hole, and we looked into that universe and we saw intelligent thinking beings, and we could trace that universe had been made by purely material forces, would that disprove the argument?
Okay, if we could trace that it was made by purely material forces and there was no normativity in this alternate universe that spun out.
No, and there was. Like we saw beings, and they were thinking, and they had some idea of logic, and they had some idea of justice.
Yeah,
would that falsify the argument?
I mean, if we could prove it,
how would that be different from an alien planet in this universe?
I mean,
well, I
think
because we don't know where this universe came from, right? That's one of the confounding variables here.
I'm trying to figure out the difference between your scenario and then just saying, well, what if an impersonal thing created what we have, and then I right now in this universe, and I guess where I'm stuck is I'm trying to imagine how that's possible to establish actions like forgiveness as real moral actions.
Okay.
I mean, Tavo, on your hypothetical, that black hole started in our universe, so it's going to carry the same normative force from whatever structures exist in our universe, right?
Yeah.
No, you're right. It sort of kicks the can one level, right? So if we'd have to say we don't know where that really came from, because secondarily it came from our universe, but we only know that's a second generation sort of phenomenon. I was just asking the question because I thought it would be a good question and help you both clarify what I think is the crux of the argument.
Yeah, let me go back to the toddler thing. Curt is here 1 second.
Yeah. Let me get back to
the toddler,
and then I'll be happy to step down.
Yeah, I think the problem is when encountering this question, I'm thinking, well, I could use a Christian standard to evaluate and judge what happened, or which Curt probably isn't going to accept, and he's going to ask more questions based on that to evaluate Christianity. Or I could use like a secular model to evaluate that. And it's hard to even evaluate who's at fault without assuming a grounding either way. So that's my difficulty. Can you see what I'm saying?
Well, okay, so
to even judge anything.
The toddler's going to have a very, very different response typically to falling down while running and scraping their knee, which will hurt,
Yep.
and to being kicked and it hurting, right? But
Yes.
the pain is going to be the same, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Right? So we agree on that.
Yes.
And so the question then is the pain enough to justify, in your view, a genuine moral claim against the kicker? Or does only the kid who went to Sunday school have the genuine moral claim? Because they both have genuine moral claims. I think I don't know that I like buy the whole idea of genuine morality, but if it has any meaning, I would certainly think they both have genuine moral claims, right?
Well, I like what you brought up about the kicking versus the skinning of the knee, because the kicking has personal involvement and therefore moral culpability, whereas the impersonal involvement of the floor skinning the kid's knee does not have moral culpability. So I think what you said actually makes my point clearer, is the necessary need for personal interaction for that genuine morality to happen in the first place. Which would
so that you would agree that the kid who's grounding his moral claim in simply the pain of being kicked is still making a genuine moral claim.
Who is the claim against when the kid skins his knee on the ground? Is it the ground? What's the claim against?
No, the kid has, like, a kid will typically not yell at the ground after they fall and skin their knee. They won't yell at anyone. They won't say that was wrong.
So there's no culpability. So the kid would not be angry at a person or have a.
I don't think most kids make a moral claim against the sidewalk when they fall.
Agreed.
Doesn't that prove ReEx's point? Right, that
No.
the sidewalk can't commit a moral wrong because it's not personal.
Oh, sure. I mean, if all our questioning is like whether inanimate objects can have morality, I completely agree that they can't. So
Great.
But
Then
I don't know that it's demonstrated, therefore, that
then.
But I don't think that demonstrates that people can have like a morality that's genuine in the way that you're describing it, either in a way that's different between one person and another. And that's what I'm trying to tease out. I was never like defending the idea of immoral sidewalks. I'm talking about, does the kid who goes to Sunday school have the better moral claim and the more genuine moral claim than the kid who just hurts when he gets kicked?
See, in my worldview, if we're going to use that as the grounding, then I would say that if we have mutual kicking where it's both unjustified, then they're both wrong. And whether or not somebody has exhaustive theological knowledge of the permissiveness of kicking is besides the point. And that can come in like morality, in terms of like morality itself is real, but the degrees of fault are various. And so,
Okay,
so I don't think
so
I don't think it's a right versus wrong. I thought that was a false dichotomy.
No. So this is great.
I feel like you all are making progress, but
yeah, we made great progress. So I think like I'm ready to step down, but I just want to
can I get to
where
anyone,
we agree too.
Yeah, let's do this. If anyone is time sensitive in the private chat, let me know, because I think we've reached a kind of a good resolution point, at least.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I didn't want Curt to feel like I'm avoiding it. I genuinely didn't quite understand it without finding. I think what the issue was is, in order to ask me such a question, I need to select a grounding, and I didn't know if you wanted me to not select one, or if I decided just to select one.
I'm happy to give you like what I saw as their groundings, right? So what I want to suggest
the grounding of my evaluation criteria.
Objective ethics and is waiting and is short on time. So
let me just highlight the agreement, and then I'll bump off.
Okay, sounds good.
So the agreement that we have is that no one needs to assent to a proposition to make these kind of claims, because you agree that they both have grounding.
They live in a universe with sufficient grounding for morality, not that their personal understandings of things is the grounding for the claim in and of itself.
Wonderful. That's totally, we agree. I agree. Okay, wonderful. Okay. That's great. It's good talking to you.
Right. And that'll be a personal grounding.
And thanks for being a friend of the channel, Dr. Curt. Thanks for getting me up to 1,000 subs. All right, I'm going to bring up objective ethics. I'm really curious to see what their impressions are. And because Simos Funk has been on the list for a while, I'm going to bring Simos up as well. Simos, are you okay, like, kind of sharing the time with objective ethics? And like, I'm kind of skipping ahead of you just a little bit, and I just don't want to be too unkind in doing that.
I think Simos is taking his beauty rest. Objective
Okay,
ethics,
gotcha.
how are you?
Good, brother. Nice to see you, Rex. Good to see you, Tavo. Always good to share a stage with Simos. I have a tremendous
Yeah,
amount of respect
no, I'm
for you,
good.
brother.
I'm good. Just carry on. You go ahead first, objective ethics.
All right. Yeah, my wife is wanting me to
Thanks,
do something with dinner here in a minute. But I just really quickly, I wanted to touch on when I spoke to you, I thought you had said that you don't need tag to run this argument. And I will admit I missed 90% of the show. I'm coming in late, but it sounds to me just listening to you talk to people that you're relying heavily on tag to ground this whole argument. So I'll be curious when I go rewatch the stream if am I missing something here? It seems like
let me clarify for you, because tag, would you agree that tag begins with the God of the Bible and ends with the God of the Bible?
No, I mean I've heard a few different versions of tag run. So I think your version of tag is going to be that God grounds logic and reason and objective morality and intelligibility probably.
So here's my beginning point is just normativity itself, right? So normativity would include epistemic normativity, it would include moral normativity. So then I have an abductive stage, which is not transcendental. The first part's transcendental, because to criticize the existence of normativity is to use a normative criteria in the first place, which begs the question and leads you back to normativity. So that's a first stage. Then I go through an abductive process, which goes through different criteria that I believe impersonal sources for normativity and basis for normativity do not meet and lack explanatory power compared to a personal source for normativity. And then I have a deductive stage that is not mathematically deductive. I do not claim that this argument is complete or that it's mathematically deductive, but I do believe that there is a self-consumption that atheism commits, because if it doesn't have a sufficient ground for a normative binding source, then it also cannot bind minds with the law of identity to identify atheism, or the law of non-contradiction to distinguish atheism from anything else, and thereby taking the atheist position, which would remove normative binding force, you would eliminate not only atheism on atheism's terms, but everything else on atheism's terms. Not an ontological claim, but a normative claim that would bind premises to conclusions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I'm following you. There's the metaphysical claim to normativity is a whole different argument altogether, to be honest with you. I think when we talk about morality, and most people are thinking of the normative and the oughts, like what I do, ought not do, and that's based in normal behavior that people have access to using reason. And we don't expect a psychopath to make normal or normative decisions because they are mentally, cognitively unable to do so, right? So the normative applies to what rational people would do. That's how most people understand normativity. When you go to the metaphysical grounding of what actually makes an ought or an ought not, that's really another conversation that gets into the, like you said, the ontological metaphysical. And I don't think that we need to go any further than nature and the natural law of things, the natural order, the fact that we evolved to be a social species grounds all of this, in my opinion. And when you talk about the personal need for these things, I think we are people, and we ultimately ground this in our behavior is grounded in the fact that we're a social animal. When you talk to Robin, you said something about we don't. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so definitely correct me if I misheard you. But it sounded to me like when she said something about the justice thing, for example, when we talk about normative here, you said that we don't blame causes, we blame the individual who specifically commits the action. Is that what you had said? Did I miss that?
Yeah.
So I would say that seems demonstrably false, because we actually saw, let me give you a counterexample and see if we're on the same page here. Because if I use your analogy, so a guy goes into a bank and he uses a weapon or a note or whatever and hands it to the teller and says, give me all the money or I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. The teller puts the money in the bag and the guy runs away. The cops catch the bank robber. They do not arrest the teller, because even though she's the one that put the money in the bag, because she put the money in the bag because she was coerced by the actual, what we would consider the bank robber, right? So in the example of, you brought up David in the essay of the wives, which is a common atheist argument against ethical Christianity, right? So in that story, God takes credit for sending Absalom to do this terrible thing. He uses Absalom as a tool to dispense God's own justice against David, right, as punishment. So it would seem that God is in fact culpable, because culpability can be split between maybe Absalom and God. But I would say that Absalom is maybe a victim himself in this situation, that really God takes partial or all of the guilt by holding the culpability.
Okay, so all the guilt would mean that Absalom has no guilt for the essay, even though it was his choice and he referred to it. Because even if you want to take the biblical worldview, then the biblical worldview is not that Absalom was a possessed puppet at that moment, and God was just using him as a ragdoll to do those things. So if you want to take it based on face value, you would have to say that Absalom even in his will, was not culpable for what he did and wanted to do.
That's not my understanding of the biblical worldview. Although I have heard some Christians, excuse Absalom in a variety of, or excuse God in a variety of different ways. I don't think anywhere in the text it gives the indication that Absalom has any free will in the situation. I think God specifically takes all the credit for this happening. So
got it.
So the biblical, I would say the biblical view is that such that God caused Absalom to go do this. He rose Absalom up against David. That would be, what choice did Absalom have? It's not clear to me in the text anyway.
Okay. So when you evaluate God's guilt, do you use a personal or an impersonal standard to evaluate his guilt?
So what I use is what I tap into my reason and empathy, which is where I think morality comes from. I think all morality is going to be grounded in reason and empathy, which is why we don't consider tigers to be immoral when they eat deer, because they don't have access to this reason and empathy in the same way that we have access to this same reason and empathy on our level. And so we make these social contracts with each other. This is all grounded in evolution, right?
Well,
so it's the grounding.
Hold on. Mm-hmm. Just because reason and empathy are real, what makes them binding to me?
What makes them binding to you is because it actually affects you. Like chemically, your brain is chemically affected by empathy. Like you have a natural proclivity, if you are a normal person and engage in normative behavior, to certain behaviors, because that's what makes us a social species. We wouldn't have evolved if we were out there chopping each other up with axes all the time. Now, some people do engage in this behavior, but overall, we have access to this. Like if I look out my window and there is a person who attacks a lady with a knife and takes her purse, I don't look out the window and say, oh, shiny metal object, human being, Homo sapien, stabbed, blood flowing, and that's what I see. I look out the window and say, oh my gosh, some lady just got mugged or assaulted. I need to go do something. That's my natural proclivity to that situation. This is grounded in who we are, who we've evolved to be, right?
Well, how does that not just boil down to a description of phenomena?
It is a description of phenomena that what I see, I have chemical reactions to, right? Those chemical reactions cause a certain particular thought process to go through my mind. And then I assess that thought process as X, Y, and Z, which is an assault on this poor lady, right?
Right. So the chemical reactions would not, what is the relationship between chemical reactions and reason?
How we process those back and forth. So I'm a compatibilist. I take the compatibilist view. I think we do have an ability to process information internally, mentally, right? In our own psyche to say, do I want to make this choice or this choice? But I think 90% of our decision making is actually predetermined.
But we have we have the same chemical. Look, for example, if I'm the stabber, right? I also have chemical reactions going on. So we need a value of criteria of the tiebreaker between your chemical reactions and my chemical reactions that triangulates us, by which I am wrong and you are right. What is that?
I agree with you. And I think that's where the reason and empathy come in. That's where the normative, actually, how we build these normative claims and we build laws around this. So the majority of people would say that and say that's a wrong behavior. Whereas it's most likely that when this person is the stabber, right? Which I don't want to use you personally, because I don't think you'd do something like that. So just random stabber.
I'm just making myself the bad guy so you can be the good guy. So I'm not trying to put you in a bad light.
No, you're all right, brother. You're all right. But the hypothetical, the stabber in this scenario, it's quite likely, if not probable, that we would do an examination, a psyche eval on this person and determine, oh my goodness, this person has an antisocial personality disorder, or this person was high on drugs, or some other comorbid or something type of factors that actually lead to why this unnormal behavior, this abnormal behavior was being engaged in, this criminal behavior.
See, here's the thing. When I hear that, real quick, Tavo, I just want to say it reads to me as a design claim when you say he's got this, we got to evaluate him by some criteria. Well, if the criteria is happening on the same phenomenological grounds that is physical, just like yours, then the evaluative criteria is not what's physical, not what's emergent, and not what's descriptive, but something beyond that. And so if you're saying reason is beyond that, then reason's not instantiated in you. Because if it's instantiated in you, it would be instantiated in me. We're both humans having chemical reactions. Go ahead, Tavo.
I guess my point would be you need another criteria other than empathy, right? Because empathy can be turned off. The chemical reaction can be muted, right? You can dehumanize a population to the point that another population won't care if they're doing significant damage to them. Like I was on an atheist chat last night, and I won't go into all the details, but they were talking favorably about an individual who was murdered with very little empathy. Now, I would still argue that that's morally wrong, even if they didn't have the right concatenation of chemicals in their brains and the right reactions to those chemicals, right? So there's still ought to be an external standard if there is moral grounding.
No, not necessarily. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with what you mean by external standard. I don't think so, because now, for
Your
one thing, it doesn't
your
actually
standard
matter
is
if you're
empathy.
a moral realist like myself, or if you're an anti-realist, or you're an emotivist. All of these claims ultimately do tap into our empathy and reason. Every single one of these moral positions does at some point tap into this empathy and reason. So even if I just grant for a second, okay, let's pretend the God character exists, and you guys are going with divine command theory. If it says it in the Bible,
I don't do command theory,
well,
that's, but we'll go with it just so you go ahead.
Yeah, it would have to be something like that. If it's not grounded in, if you're not grounding it in divine command theory, if you're actually saying there is this natural, this moral.
I'm not saying that either, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure. You have two options, right? You either have a supernatural or you have a natural.
I have a supernatural that is not divine command theory, because I think divine command theory does fall prey to the Euthyphro dilemma, but mine, I don't think mine does.
It does have problems. But the other issue then is how do we have access to what is actually moral or not moral if we don't use our own human intuition? If our own empathy and reason fails us and is not something that we can count on for making moral assessments, how do we judge this other criteria that you're saying exists? How do we know if that even is morally good or not? How do we make that assessment?
So are you making an assessment from an impersonal grounding to make a judgment, or a personal grounding to make, like, are we assuming my grounding in order to have directionality?
Yeah, but if I'm a human being and you're saying, oh, there's this moral grounding out here, this metaphysical grounding, we call it God, right? And God drowns babies, and I say, well, that doesn't sound like a good idea. How do I decide that what God decided to do is good, and my moral inclination is that doing terrible things to babies is not good, is somehow wrong?
Well, that's a great question, because then that would beg the question of how we're making a value map in the first place. So this goes back to, are you using a personal or impersonal source for your value map when you say, oh, I think what God did is wrong, and then it's like, okay, what do these values come from? You say empathy and logic, but if empathy and logic are just the merchant of evolutionary pressures, that's just descriptive, not prescriptive. It's just,
but I'm not begging the question.
It's just what it is.
Yeah, but you say I'm begging the question. I'm asking a question. You can't beg the question if you're asking a question. That's not how that fallacy works. So I'm asking you again.
But the implication of the question is that God is wrong. So what do we do?
No, I'm not implying it. I'm asking a straightforward question. There's no implication. I'm looking for an answer here. Okay. If I don't have access to empathy and reason, or if my empathy and reason, right, doesn't give me access to moral truth because it goes against what God is doing and commanding, how do I know what God is doing and commanding is good, and that my empathy and reason is now failing me? And what good does empathy and reason have to do at all at all at that point? What role does that even play in biology?
I think no matter what worldview you'd have to say, if I'm judging a thing as wrong, I have to figure out the basis by which it is wrong. Because if I just say, well, it's empathy, how do I know my empathy is correct and not just an evolutionary illusion? How can I tell that I'm using an evaluative criteria that's not dependent upon my fallible faculties? Now, I can agree that we have fallible faculties, but the reason I can say that is because I know that we have a design to our brain. I know that we can fall short of it. And to even talk about falling short of it means there's a standard by which we ought to think in the first place, which is why Dillahunty, when I asked him, ought we believe true things and disbelieve false things, he said he couldn't ground that as an ought, which dissolves any of this normative direction of any logic, reason, or empathy in the first place.
Yeah, but you're asking me a question. I'm asking you a question. You're answering the question.
Because okay. I'm asking, let's put it this way. I want to at least clarify where I'm coming from. So if I say God is wrong, and I say, take a moment of my claim, what basis would I say God is wrong? And I'd be using him as my basis. If God does own everything and God can determine what he's going to do, then it comes down to the property rights of God. Even if we find what he does ghastly, we could say, like Genesis 50:20, that what people meant for evil, God meant for good. And we could look at Romans 8 and say that God uses all things for his glory and our good. And again, that obviously people are going to be punished. People are going to be sent to hell. Horrible things are going to happen. On Dillahunty's show, I admitted that, like, God is, I'm more of on the predestination side. So I believe that God preordained these things, but that doesn't translate to culpability, because I am also compatibilist to the theist variety, where I believe that God does decree that these things are going to happen, but people are acting in ways they otherwise are acting because their heart is in agreement with those things. So can I tell you exactly the mechanisms, how that works? I admit I can't, but that's where I'm at.
Okay. No, I think that's a fair response. And I think you are limited in epistemically, or in even trying to flesh that out, because it seems to me that you're just back into divine command theory at that point, especially when you start talking about predestination. And I think the verse you're talking about, if I remember right, you're talking about Romans 8:28. It's not for our good; it's for the good of those who serve Him. So it all goes back to the God character.
I agree.
Okay.
It's because obviously it's not for the good of somebody that they're going to hell. It's for their damnation. It's for their condemnation and destruction.
All right. Oh, dinner is walking through the door. Hey, I really appreciate the time, Simos. Thanks for letting me jump on your feet there. All right,
Objective ethics. Let me just say, objective ethics. I really appreciate your kind demeanor and your willingness to have like conversations and take turns, because a lot of times that doesn't happen. And so I'm really happy you came up. You're very intelligent, and I just want to say all those things.
Yeah, I hope you all grow to become friends, and I hope people will subscribe to the Objective Ethics channel. It's a really wonderful channel, and you go live every Sunday at what time?
Every Sunday, 4 p.m. Eastern. Yeah.
4 p.m. Eastern time.
We do an open panel at some point. I usually have special guests. This Sunday, I'm talking to a Chinese philosopher about non-dualist philosophies, Taoism, Buddhism, and she has an interesting way that she talks. She brings quantum physics into all this, so it should be a pretty interesting conversation. Thank you so much, you guys. Enjoy the talk as always.
Really great to see you. Thanks for joining. And Simos, this is your first time being on the channel, so
it is, yes.
Thanks for joining. Yeah.
Hello, everybody.
Simos, I consider Simos a friend of mine, so
yeah, I do as well. So I'm sure we're gonna. Yeah, I'm just here to make a few criticisms, and then you take what you will from it. I've got no issue.
How about you give the criticisms, and then I'll just listen, and then I can respond after.
I'm only going to give one, and then because I just think argument one falls. And then after that, every argument falls for the same reason.
Okay.
So all of the rest of it, I think is, and I literally, by the time I'd finished writing down the first argument, you were on argument 3. So, I had to catch up a little bit, and it was just very fast. And I'd like to ask this first of Tavo, if I may use some of this video to go through and do a critique at a much slower pace, and maybe we can address. I can address with a few people the rest of the arguments in a much more genuine and in-depth way, rather than just giving this brief critique.
Yeah, clip away. That's kind of you to ask. Thanks. Of course, you don't need to, but I appreciate it. And feel free to tag me when you do that, right? So you can just at Tavo Abri, and I'll check it out, because I'm curious to see your analysis of the argument.
Sure.
And then tag me as well, because obviously me putting this out there, you know that if it gets anywhere, it's going to get everywhere, and it'll be like a piñata for so many people.
Well, you're going to be welcome as well, obviously, to use it. Use the one I do as the critique to then re-critique it. So we'll do it in the old-fashioned YouTube way, which is just make videos at each other rather than dialogue. Personally, because I think a lot gets missed, and I think your argument is very complicated. And I appreciate, but I do think it's tag at the end of the day.
I know you do.
It seems to me you've gone through and said things like, well, in a genuine way, I mean this, and I don't mean it in a derogatory form, right? I mean, Planting is a very special guy. He's very intelligent, and he put a lot of thought into his arguments, and they made a lot of people convinced, of course. So, I'm not putting that down. But let me just say the critique first. Okay, so I think that it comes down to this. You say in argument 1, establish a transcendent necessary personal ground for the normative authority through the structure of rational discourse. Okay. Am I quoting you correctly there?
Perhaps. I don't remember everything I said an hour ago, 2 hours ago.
Okay, it was from slide 1. So
okay, and part of that might be Claude. So I could refine my language. So if that be the case, critique away, please.
Okay, so my critique here really is I'm not sure that rational discourse needs a grounding. First of all, so you'd have to demonstrate that grounding is what's required there. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, there are people that think that it does need a grounding, but it can be grounded just through the human concept. Right, just through conceptual analysis, we could say, yes, we have minds, and it's our minds that invented discourse, and therefore, we can ground it in our own minds. And I don't think that's too much of a problem. if that's what you mean. But you're saying there's a transcendent source that this is going to be related back to grounding. So my
Correct.
critique really is that when you say that normative authority is grounded in God, right, that's what makes it a tag argument. And I think if from then on, every normative term that you use has that connotation, that God, in fact, is the grounding. If every term you use thereafter, normative term you use thereafter, I mean, you're not going to equivocate, I hope, otherwise you've already lost the argument right there. But if you're not going to, in order to stay consistent, you're going to have to not equivocate, in which terms all of these terms of normativity that you use, such as in argument 2, justice and forgiveness, and what's it, jurisdiction in argument 3, personal ground, obliges, another normative term, right? So all of these presuppose God as the grounding because of argument 1, and that's a problem because now all. Are you talking about? Let me just get through it.
Sure.
Because that's the problem, not necessarily for your argument for the positive, right? But it's an argument for the negative. It's a problem with the negative, right? Because now all of your negative critiques on atheism, right, are external. They're externalist critiques. Okay, so none of them are internalist critiques. So none of them hold much force in terms of obligation, right, or normative, as I use the word, right? None of them are normative claims against atheism. So you're not disproving any of the contrary. In fact, all you're doing is just saying, from my worldview of God, atheism is false, right? Which is, again, just saying basically, God is the grounding for X, right? Not God cannot ground X, therefore God grounds X, right? Which is obviously an invalid argument. So that's all I'd say is the critique, right? Is once you tie in God as being a transcendent, necessary, personal grounding for normativity, then the argument becomes invalid if you want to follow through and say these arguments against atheism, because they're externalist critiques and they don't mean anything to an atheist, of course, who has a completely different worldview and uses a different definition for normative. Anyway, that's my basic critique. Go ahead.
Right. So I would say that in an ironic way, I agree with you, but only in the sense that because I don't agree that it's tag, but I would say that if normative authority is personal, then you are using a personal standard by which to judge my critique or judge my argument in that sense. So I think it actually flips the other way, because in order for you to say that I need an externalist critique because normativity presupposes God, then your normativity would presuppose God in that case. Because here's what I'm saying. If what you just admitted is, if in order to use an internalist critique, you would have to use something inside your worldview. But rationality and those rules of logic are inside your worldview because you keep using them not only to bolster your worldview, but also to critique mine. Therefore, I can start with normativity and ask, does normativity is it better explained in the abductive sense by a personal ground as opposed to an impersonal ground? And then I have an abductive process by which to do that, which is not transcendent. So if we're both starting at the same place, and you can't say that I'm using God if we're both starting in the same place, and then call it God, and then say I lost, instead of rather implying that I established my conclusion. You're muted, by the way.
I did not mute Simos.
No, I did. I just didn't want to interrupt. I want to make sure that you get your full statement out. No, that's not quite it, I'm afraid. No, I'm saying that I have a different definition of normativity. And if you want to switch to my definition of normativity to critique the thing, then using those words like binding and obligation, etc., right, to say that rational discourse is binding on our normativity, that's not something that I think, right? That's not how I
So
ground.
here's the answer.
I would personally ground it, or that it necessarily needs grounding, even, right? Because it's language. The grounding itself is not in the language. The grounding is in the normativity, the ideas that we have, the conceptual ideas we have. That's a different thing to the actual language itself. And tying those two things together, I wouldn't do it through trying to use some transcendental argument of necessary personal beings that exist outside my
But do you
my
you
own
see what you're
mind.
doing, though? What you're doing is you're giving an ought to me that I ought to reconsider my position. You're
Oh,
using,
no, sorry. Let me just correct you straight away on
correct
that,
me.
because
Exactly.
I said, let me just say straight away, that's not what I said. What I said was that works for your argument. What it doesn't work for, without using an equivocation fallacy, is to go to the atheist argument.
Great.
Right?
So
So you
here's what I'm
can't
hearing.
disprove the atheist argument that way. Go ahead.
Here's what I'm hearing. Undergirding both of our arguments is a truth claim that I ought to abide by, that your definition, I ought to recognize your definition as distinct from mine. So we share a common reality that binds us by one single normative standard by which I ought to change my mind that I am using a good argument and that you're saying, no, I should not. And then I have to evaluate objectively, am I bound to acknowledge another argument that might be equal to or better than mine or not? That's the normative bind.
No. I'm saying that if you wish to do an internal critique, right, you cannot use your definition of the word normative, because your definition, as in argument one, your definition of the word normative, right, has in it already presupposed God. So it's nothing to do with atheism.
How is it presupposed God?
Well, because you say here, establish a transcendental necessary personal ground for normative authority through the structure of rational discourse.
Yeah, that would be in the conclusion of the argument. But in order to say that, so you're saying that because your definition of normativity is different, therefore it's not binding. But the problem is, in order for that to be true, it would have to be binding.
That may well be binding to you. I mean, that's
no,
fine.
it would. The only reason it would make sense to be an objection at all is if it's binding, not because you had an emotion, but because it's actually appealing to a For example, if I took your critique and the opposite of your critique, and I compared them side by side, the thing that would be the tiebreaker between those two things is which things would be true, because truth would be prescriptive to my thoughts. If it is true that your critique is valid, it's because there is a standard outside of us that compels me to accept that. Well, you say no, but that's the whole basis of argumentation.
Yeah, right. But that's your assumption. That's the problem. That's why you're not doing an internalist critique of my worldview.
How about
when
this?
Hang on a minute. No, because that's not how I use the word binding. I mean, a normative. But like I'm just saying, you once you've smuggled in God into the normative phrase, right, and saying, well, you must have an external personal thing in order for it to be normative, right? That becomes part of the definition. And I simply say, okay, right, now I may be able to do an internal critique of your worldview. I may even be able to say that some of these arguments are invalid, in which case, I think even by the standard of philosophy, you'd have to say, well, if I make invalid deductive arguments, they don't have the necessary conclusion is a non sequitur. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means it's a non sequitur. In which case, I think, maybe there's some kind of ought that I'm putting on you there. But I think we'd both be appealing then, right, to a really neutral standard, because I don't think either of us think that the laws of the rules that follow philosophy or validity, I think they break such strong logical pretexts, right? That
so I guess, Simos, I have a couple of
Yeah.
questions. So my first question:
Okay.
Are you a moral realist? Like, do you believe that morality is real?
Oh my goodness, yeah, that is difficult to say, really.
It's hard for me to say too. I don't have a good answer.
I mean, I guess I'm a compatibilist, so
Well,
if that makes me a moral realist, then yeah. If it doesn't, then
I guess if you're saying I have a truth claim, you ought to accept my truth claim. How do you bridge that gap, right? You're saying I have a truth claim. You're implicitly saying you ought to accept that truth claim. That's that you have a way of converting that is to an ought.
Yeah, if it's an internal critique of your argument, then I think that there is something found illogical in your argument, or argumentation, then maybe you should reconsider on the virtue of being irrational.
I mean, there are just so many standards that were implied in those things that I don't think a merely descriptive universe of goalless directions can establish meaningfully.
Yeah, well, again, the point is between an internalist critique and an externalist critique. If you decide that you have already in argument one found that there is a personal, you say this is the conclusion. If it is the conclusion of a deductive argument, that means you've already included God into the premises.
It's more abductive than it is deductive. So I don't claim that, like, especially argument two. Argument two is abductive. Right. In fact, the argument one isn't just transcendental. It starts transcendental on normativity alone. Then it goes into an abductive structure, and then it goes into a deductive structure. But it doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah, so my argument again was once you've done it in argument one, right? Once you smuggled God in as the normative structure, the normative authority, right? Then all of these other normative terms that you're using in these other arguments also have that structure. So they're all good for you, right? Not a problem. I'm not stopping you making the argument, just like I wouldn't stop someone using tag if that's what they wanted to do. All I'm saying is that when it then comes to critiquing atheist arguments, right, you can't use that definition anymore. So all of those arguments count for nothing as far as the atheist is concerned, right? Because that's not their definition of normative. So when you say there's a normative binding, right? Well, no, I don't think atheists are going to accept that for a start. And if it's not in their worldview, then you shouldn't use that as a critique to try and say that their worldview is wrong. And this is one of the issues, right? Unless you do an externalist critique, and that they don't have to accept, because, as I say, they're not going to accept the definition that you first given of normative.
Well, number one, I would say it just sounds like the house always wins, and then number two, it also sounds like here's the problem. Part of my arguments establish that if I used your term of normative binding, the entire logical superstructure of argumentation becomes essentially meaningless because it doesn't lead to conclusions necessarily, which is why when Matt Dillahunty said, I don't think I can ground that you ought to believe what is true and ought not believe what is false, that's the exact problem I'm pointing out. So adopting your definition of normative, even if, let's just say it's true and I smuggled in God, let's say I just use your definition of normative instead, it breaks down any logical progress from that point forward.
No, I don't see how that follows. I mean, either it might be the case that it's not grounded at all, right? The use of normative words just simply come from our own concepts because that's how we've developed language, i.e., Wittgenstein's second argument, right? So it has uses rather than meaning. And I think most people sort of come to that position eventually once they start using language long enough, because they find out that it is contradictory at times, and that's okay, right? We have different words which mean different things, or the same word that means different things, and when we have different words that mean the same thing, right? That's just the nature of the complexity of language, and I think that shows its human origins anyway. But that's another point. Again, the point is it may not be grounded, or even if and in OE's case, right, he grounds it in such things as acceptance of reality or an acceptance of reason, and I think both of these things, right, are invented, same as math is invented. I think logic is a language, in which case it's invented. So that's my personal worldview, and I think I can ground quite a lot of it, just the same way Curt was in his argument, right, by saying, well, look, even the lower forms of apes. We've had language for 10 million years probably, right? Plus, I mean, even what we would call rational mammals have language of a type, right? So, that's a pretty common thing. And I just think, well, okay, look, if we're going to start saying that language must have this binding force, right? I'm not even sure what binding means in that situation. Right, because it seems to me that binding in itself seems to be another normative term, right?
Yes. So
right?
Binding in that case,
in which case, well, what about, we're back to Kant again, right? hypothetical versus categorical imperatives.
Yeah,
and
so
like some people do ground their worldview in hypothetical imperatives.
Yeah,
Anyway,
so binding would be that you violated an actual standard. Either you fall short of an epistemic standard and you've made an error or a fallacy, which would describe the reference to the law in the first place, or you are guilty in the case of like a moral law, that there is an actual status of guilt that exists regardless of your worldview when you commit a sin or a crime. That's the binding part, that accountability and justice is owed to you for the wrong that you've done, and that correction is what you ought to do in the case of epistemic mistakes, such as if I say 2 + 2 is 5, well, I ought to think better. It's not moral per se, but it's still normatively binding that I ought to think differently. Let me ask you the question that I asked Matt Dillahunty, though. Do you believe we ought to believe that which is true? No. Okay.
No, evolutionary speaking, no. It's been for our survival. There are some things that are false that we should believe in order to survive.
Okay.
So it's the rustling in the bushes. The rustling in the bushes. If it's a snake or something, well, we don't know, but we better back off first, find out what's in there before we proceed.
What about at this point in the conversation? What about at this point in the what about in this point in the conversation? Like you'd say, in the past we should have had beliefs that are false, but in the context of this conversation, would you agree that there is an ought to believe what's true?
I think, I would, and I would ground that on an irrationality. Yeah, it seems irrational to be told the truth and then reject it.
I mean, I want to steel man some of what you're saying, because I think behind the scenes, kind of more privately, when he's not advocating for this argument, ReEx has been quite epistemically humble. And I think, ReEx, you would agree that argument 1 is stronger than argument 2, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. And then number 2, I actually think it's similar to TAG. I think the methodology is a little bit different. I think it's okay to say that there are similarities. It's something that the chat has talked about several times, and we've sort of danced around it. To me, TAG is like if a physician kind of looks at a patient and says, this is the diagnosis, and I'm going to align everything with this diagnosis, and anything outside of the symptoms, the diagnosis, and our treatment of that diagnosis is outside of the conversation. It's not intelligible, right? That's sort of what TAG is to me. Now, you're like a physician who says, what is the central feature that this patient is presenting with, right? What is the finding? And then what you do is you look through all possible explanations of that finding, and then you say, this particular diagnosis is the most likely one. So it's a subtle methodological difference. They're related. I think, like your argument, you would admit, owes a lot to TAG. Yes, but it is at least a refinement that I think it's a fairly novel refinement.
Yeah, because TAG does not have an abductive structure. It doesn't separate the religion from the non-religion. It doesn't have a deductive structure. It's only transcendental. Mine uses all three.
Yeah. Okay. So just to thank you, Tavo, for that. Just to reassess or reassert, I should say, what I'm trying to explain is that argument 1. You say that's the conclusion that I wrote down. Establish transcendent necessary personal ground for a normative authority through the structure of rational discourse.
The conclusion I give would be a personal source, but I start with normativity, which atheists and myself share. Now, you would say it's a definitional difference, and by necessity. And I would agree in the sense of whatever comes out as the conclusion would necessitate the definition of the beginning. So it would go back to, I guess it would say it would go back to presuppositions, which I'm trying to functionally avoid so as to start on ostensibly neutral ground. Right. But if we're using, which would be an interesting, because if we both agree that normativity exists, which if we're holding to a standard, like I don't think when I'm talking to you and you want me to be logical, you're using your own private evolutionary adaptive behaviors to tell me how I ought to think. You're using something that is between us, that transcends us, that I ought to attain to, and you're saying you're not, and that's kind of confusing to me.
Right. No, I'm not really saying that. I mean, I think I'm claiming that the things that you are saying give support, abductive support to the idea of normativity having a personal grounding don't actually do that in my worldview, right? So there's the difference between our definition of how we're going to end up at normativity. We're not going to have the same conclusion, right? Just the same way Curt was saying, well, how do you tell which one's true, right? And I know you're trying to say here that, look, because of all these other arguments later, and I would really want to know what are the premises that you give for the argument one, right? Because I think that's crucial. I really think argument one is where we're going to find the difference.
Well, that's where you lie with argument one. And by lie, I mean that's where your domain is, as far as my argument is.
Well, I mean, I just think that if you can do what the conclusion is, if there is a necessary argument, and I do agree with both premises, right, then I think everything else follows, right? So I'm not convinced yet, but my problem is that all of the normative terms that you used throughout the entire rest of your presentation, right, were based on argument one.
Yes, I agree that argument two follows from argument one, and that argument two assumes that a personal source has been reached at either abductively as the best explanation. I totally admit that. But what I'm saying is your version of normativity, I boil down to just a description, and then not very useful in terms of what it would mean to bind me to logic and be reasonable, and what the meaning of healthy is. So that's where we disagree. Is I think that the normative claims of secularists boil down to just a phenomenological observation, and that's where we disagree.
Yeah. Okay. So I would disagree. I would disagree with that. First of all, I know plenty.
I've sort of lost track of time. I think we've got time for. We've got Horus next. Maybe I think that's the only person next.
Okay, but, let me just finish up then, and I'll be happy to leave as well. So thanks, Rex, obviously. But no, I would disagree. I certainly know plenty of very high-level PhD philosophy professors which would disagree with that particular statement, that find grounding to be justified in terms of giving value to. And I don't think normative claims are just descriptive. No, I think language is descriptive, and as thinking people, we've invented categorical claims. And I think that Kant, in terms of using transcendental argument to try and justify that, was certainly onto something, and that's probably why Tavo suspects that I'm using some kind of transcendental argument, but I don't think I am. I just think I'm using the idea of sorry, that's just put me off. I'm just using the idea, we've had this conversation before, Rex, so I won't belabor it. But I would ground such things like human traits in evolution and in human nature itself, and that can be an objective standard in that we can scientifically measure what humans do and how they behave. But that doesn't give you any purchase, I don't think, on normative claims or normative language, because of course we use purpose-driven language all the time, right? And I think Hume's right when he says you can't get an ought from an is. So my thing is, you're in argument one, if that's the conclusion, then you're using normative terms in the premises.
My argument is that atheists.
And I would like to know. And I would like to say again.
My argument is partially that atheists are deriving a not from an is when they invoke epistemic normativity to Christians, and to say that your argument is bad, therefore you ought to abandon it. And I'm binding you with this argument as change your actions and change your thoughts. That's the guillotine reversed.
Yeah, no, I don't think you can. By the same thing, it works backwards as well. I think if you start claiming, start claiming Hume is on your side, then no, he certainly wasn't. And
I didn't claim he was on my side. I'm saying that he didn't anticipate that, and I'm not alone in that, because Stefan Molyneux many years ago said, so I ought not derive an ought from an is, because it's true that I ought not derive an ought from an is, because implicit to Hume's guillotine is an ought for my epistemics.
Yeah, that just doesn't follow as far as I'm concerned. But I mean, I think Hume's kind of distinction between is and oughts was a critique really of religion and the way that oughts can be derived from a higher power, which is just not there. But no, I think we derive oughts for sure. there's no doubt about that. However, I think that there can be an objective standard, which is standard, which we can ad hoc or a posteriori measure independently of any individual. Right. So I think that's true. And, that's simply why I just think that there is a version of normativity here, which you're not really considering. And for the same reason, I think it's a stalking horse argument in some sense, that it stalks the is-ought problem. But no, if your argument if your first argument, if that is the conclusion, then you're also going to have to smuggle in a normative term into the premises. So I'd like to see how that's done.
Well, that's the thing is normativity is essential to argumentation if premises lead to conclusions anyway. So to argue against it is to affirm. I mean, you can say no, but your no is a claim that to the contrary that I'm sure you're justifying on premises. So I mean, I don't know what to tell you.
No, I just think that if you don't have an ought in your conclusion, then you don't need an ought in your premises.
You have an ought in logic.
Just because something's grounded doesn't mean the conclusion is necessarily an ought.
I didn't follow. Tavo, could you help me with what he meant by that? I'm lost. I admit.
I think he's saying making the argument doesn't imply that you ought to accept the reasoning of the argument.
Yeah, I agree that just the presence of an argument is not the compelling. But what I'm saying is, if an argument is valid and sound, I think Simos, I would like to think that he would agree that you ought to follow sound and valid logic, but he doesn't allow for the ought because of the same reason Dillahunty does not allow for the ought.
I certainly would agree that if I thought an argument was sound, then I should accept the conclusion as necessary. I completely agree with that. However, my objection
there's a should there.
Right, that's the should.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there's no doubt on the basis of irrationality, right? You're just being irrational if you don't, right? So, okay.
But what gives rationality value as opposed to irrationality if you have a tiebreaker?
There's no tiebreaker.
Then there's no value claim.
If you think it's sound, you've already accepted the conclusion. That's not a tiebreaker. If you deny the conclusion of a sound argument, you're just being irrational. Full stop.
Okay, but irrational is just a descriptive claim without a value claim to split irrationality and rationality. So where's the value that there's a tiebreaker between those two?
Sorry, I didn't quite follow that either.
We have rationality and irrationality side by side, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is the tiebreaker, the value claim that obligates me to one or the other?
Oh, okay. Well, if I can do an internal critique of your worldview and show that one of the premises is not sound, i.e., it falls to an informal fallacy, right? Then that might be one of the tiebreakers. Or if I can show the argument is invalid, then that would show a formal fallacy, and that would definitely make a difference between the tiebreaker. If you couldn't show my worldview internally, I didn't suffer from the same problem.
Tavo, could you highlight what's going on here?
No.
Okay. So
because I should not.
You have to do an internal critique.
You can't obligate me to.
No,
I think.
But here's what I'm trying to say, Simos. You continued to make the same value claim without explaining why it has value. You just said if it's irrational, then it would be fallacious and not logical. And if it's logical, then it would be sound, and therefore the very soundness of it is the value, which is kind of the question at hand.
Not quite what I'm saying. If it's valid, it's still logical, right?
Sure.
So yeah. It could be unsound. It could be unsound and still be logical.
Sure. Let's no problem. But there's okay. What I mean is, if we're talking about rationality versus irrationality, and maybe I should have used that term instead. And then you use criteria for what qualifies as rational and irrational. What gives the value to rationality over irrationality, other than the fact that they are just what they are? Is that your claim? Is they just have value and that's just how it is?
No. I'm saying that if we're trying to use logical arguments, right, and we use a deductive argument, right, then that accepts certain rules. And the certain rules are that A, the form of the argument is valid, and B, that we both accept that the premises are sound. That's when we would agree that it's a rational argument. Right?
Okay,
Now,
but
if either of those things don't obtain, right, internally in your worldview or internally in my worldview, then if it's in my worldview, I would be irrational for not accepting, for accepting them to be rational.
Let
right?
me
Because
propose.
they're breaking these fundamental rules of logic, right?
Let me
And when we're
propose.
talking about propositions, okay, we're not talking about the real world. We're just talking about conceptual details, and they operate in the mind. So yes, we can use things like axiological explanations, and that's what I'm
Let
doing.
me
Yeah.
propose that we add Horus the hero to the conversation, because I
Sure.
feel like
I can disappear. I I
I'm
said the
actually
point I
okay with
wanted
you.
to say.
I'm okay with you staying on, actually. I
Okay.
think you might have some. Unless you, I value your time as I value everyone.
No, that's fine. I'll stay on for a little while just to be
Yeah,
on screen. And let's. Thank you, Rex. I appreciate it.
two very important notes. I'm always on every, and Horace, you're live with us now, by the way. I'm always on every single Monday, 5 p.m. Pacific time, so I'm happy to go over this. I'm not entirely sold on triage, but I think it has a lot of strengths to it. I think it's in a waypoint where it will likely be made stronger. And Rex has already sent me several versions of it, so I think we'll see future iterations. But here's the really important thing, and this is probably the most important thing that I'll say on this whole video, is I want you to all stop what you're doing right now, open up a new browser, and subscribe to Rex's channel. It's a really fantastic channel. I'll put up the link in just one more moment, but it is really fantastic. Somebody of Rex's caliber should really be way over 1,000 subs. So I'm really grateful to the people who've joined, and to the people who are weighing in, and the people who hopped up to the channel. But I'll put up Rex's channel again while you all keep talking. And just as a reminder, please do stop what you're doing. If you're doing surgery, drop the scalpel and other instruments. If you're doing any other sensitive procedure, if you're stop what you're doing right now. Subscribe to Rex. Very important. All right, but you're live with us, Horace. If you want to ask any other questions.
Can you hear me or no?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Perfect.
Hey, how's it going?
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Hey guys. Hi, Rex.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Just jumping in here. Just jumping in the conversation. Yeah, go ahead. Finish up. Just continue on.
I mean, I was just going to let Simos just have the last word. I think we're kind of at an impasse.
Yeah, I think I've said what I need to say. I think that if your argument, or you come to the conclusion in argument one, that is your conclusion in argument one, then I think you're unless you're equivocating on the word normative when it comes to the atheist arguments, then they all fail. And even then, I'm still not. I'm going to have to go through this in much more careful detail. But my suspicion is that no, well, I won't say that. I think that you need to do an internalist critique of atheism in order to really show that that's the case. And as I was going through it in my mind, I was thinking, yeah, but when's he going to use the atheist version of normativity, which doesn't include God? Right? And I think my very opening statement was of such a point, right? Which is to say, I can use normative language because I'm a mind, right? So that gives me the ability to use these words and have some sense of usage when I do so, to talk about axiological explanations for why I think that it's important to operate in the universe as an agent without actually having any reference to a transcendental source. So yeah, that's another point altogether.
If I might ask you this, two questions. First, what is the tiebreaker for you between Christianity and atheism? And second question, if there was a survival advantage to Christianity over atheism, would that make you a Christian?
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, I think I would have been a Christian back in the day when it did make a difference. I think in the modern world, we've managed to exclude enough of the environment in order for it not to make any difference whatsoever. In fact, I think in the last 300 years, as science has progressed, it's become less and less relevant to answering questions about reality. And then, therefore, as we've discovered, right, atheism has been on the rise, deism first, of course, and then weaker forms of atheism, and then stronger forms of atheism. So I think there is some abductive inferences that can be made there as well. But I just don't think that I don't think it's awfully that important in sense of you know, it's important in terms of some of your later arguments, like when you say the Bible's inerrant and stuff like that. You know, I think that's a problem. That's not very epistemically
Well, I would have to. Okay, well, I don't think it.
Um,
No, I don't think it affects the epistemic humility, because if I have this book and I claim it's from God and it's got errors in it, then it can't be from God, right?
Yeah, but then I think
it's a
don't
fair
you accept-
criteria.
Yeah, well, don't you accept that the best you can say it's inspired by God? It can't be written by God.
Well, I mean, on the Bible's terms, it's written through men, but the inspiration comes from God. So I agree
Exactly,
that in the physical world, it was pen to paper. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Simos
I think
is sounding like Rabbi Horowitz.
as a fallibilist, then, which I think is the natural state of the world. I just think that we don't have omniscience, so we can't possibly know whether all of these things are true. And again, that would be one of my critiques that I wrote down in the side chat as well, by the way, because you made an argument saying that we can know stuff if it's through revelation, and I just don't think that's the case. We'd have to know all truths. Oh, we can know truth. I think you made the claim, and I don't think we can know truth with a capital T. The Gettier. The Gettier problems show that.
Let me try to do a better job of bringing Horus into the conversation.
Yeah, please. Okay, I'm ready to finish there. I really am. I really appreciate the chat again. Let's do it again sometime on your channel.
I'd love that. Yeah, stick around. And Horus, what questions?
That was great. Yeah, thanks, Simos. That was excellent. I appreciate that. Hello?
What are your questions for us, Horus? Yeah.
I see. I'm sort of resonating with what Simos and Curt and the others had to say. I think it just kind of falls apart from argument number one.
What's the reason you think?
I hear a lot of sort of prepositions and falsifiable claims, and that. So going back just to so you're on solid ground with that by stating you cannot argue against God without treating logic and truth as genuinely binding on minds. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was specifying with one of my slides, but I don't know if you can argue against any idea without.
I think Simos mentioned that just the equivocation as well between using logic and explaining logics, because everyone in the world has logic, including atheists and children and even AI. So using logic doesn't establish the existence. So the existence, of any particular deity. So I don't see how you get
that's
to that.
kind of my point, actually. That's why I tried to, because tag would have been starting with God and ending with God in some versions. Obviously, objective ethics said that there are some transcendentals that use the God is a necessary precondition of intelligibility. Intelligibility exists, therefore God, or something like that. But mine's not doing that. I start with epistemic normativity as well as moral normativity, because in my experience, atheists, if you say that we should take away fetus deletus clinics, if we should have prayer in schools and things like that, they have an automatic moral assumption. They have an automatic moral reaction that you ought not do that, we ought stop that, and things like that. And so I'm trying.
Besides the point.
Well, let me finish real quick, because I think if we agree that we share normativity and commonality, and then the question is, what is the definition of normativity? My belief is that I address the secular versions of normativity within the abductive structure. If we start with normativity and we say, okay, what's the definition? Then I think the definition is addressed in the abductive structure, talking about all the brute fats, talking about evolutionary psychology and all that kind of stuff, because it is comparing the two and seeing if one is actually sufficient to actually bind me to change my mind if brought with fact, which is what argumentation does.
So the assumption, or the sort of the claim that you use logic, therefore your specific God exists, because I use logic too, but I'm here. I'll make the claim that your specific deity does not exist outside of, or sort of in the external world outside of your mind, and sort of the variations of different deities in a lot of the different religions.
Which is what argument 2 is about. Yes.
A lot of them are misunderstood, misconceived through sort of the nature deities in Norse and Egyptian and sort of stuff, and then it spills over into sort of this serious anthropomorphic sense. But we jumped a lot there, going from sort of logic, because logic has been around even before religions.
Yep.
In the sense of,
well, Horus, I just want to clarify the argument. The argument is not God is logical, right? The argument is we all agree that normatively we ought to pursue logic. So the question then becomes, where does that normative basis come from? In other words, can you explain if that normative basis exists?
So we're in
physics. Yeah. Now, in physics, there's two ways to get something shown, right? The first way is to show it theoretically, right? The second way is to show it empirically, right?
So we're in agreement then that.
So, well, go ahead.
We're in agreement then that logic is descriptive, not divine. So for example, gravity behaves.
Well, that's the question. That is the
question.
Yeah.
Because if it's just descriptive, then all you're doing is telling me your opinions, and that has no weight on me of how I should think or.
It's just a map. So you're also in agreement then it's just a map of sort of this. Like we get people getting into the metaphysical and all that, but it doesn't correlate with the explainable world, such as hydrogen behaves like hydrogen.
Yeah, I'm not talking about impersonal things being bound by moral norms. I'm being very specific. I'm not saying that. I think I even said so. I'm not saying that my mouse is being bound. I think that was part of my presentation, but maybe you missed that.
So just I missed the first part. So exactly, just to maybe get a better feel of where you're at. What do you mean when you say God then? Are you talking about the Abrahamic?
I'm talking about, I mean the God of the Bible, and that part of that has to do with argument 2. It starts with a personal source and not specifying any particular deity in argument 1. And I'm saying that in order to even make corrections to my view, we would have to be under the assumption that truth itself and right thinking is prescriptive to how I ought to think. That's my contention. So, and then what kind of reality obligates me to believe true things over false things?
Because I haven't heard you sort of utter any names. I haven't heard you talk about Yahweh or Jesus or quote any passages. Are you referring to some sort of deist, sort of personal creator? Like, why do you personally believe God exists in your personal life?
Well, in my personal life, I believe that Jesus Christ saved me. So that's not an argumentation. That's just
so you're a Jesus guy, and I mean, we're coming across this a lot more with the sort of this evidence, right? There's even if we had evidence, it could have been. There's a lot of issues with that because we're starting to gain evidence. It's under the real world. So have you had any? Have you had?
What do you mean, Horus, when you say we're starting to gain evidence of the real world?
Well, it's just
you're saying I live in a bubble. I'm in a prison camp somewhere.
No, I mean just with.
Well, here's the point though. If you're saying you ought to believe this because
in the real world,
the evidence, right? Then what you're doing is you're appealing to a normative standard, right? So where does that normative standard come from? You are creating an ought out of an is, and the question is, how are you doing that?
Right. I'm hearing you keep bringing it back to sort of this moral normativity.
Not even normal.
I'm not. No, that's I'm just quoting the triage argument, which, by the way, I think I'm fairly agnostic of it. I think that was a great presentation. I think I like the argument. I'm very fond of it. I don't know if I believe that it is a compelling. Like, I don't know if I'm quite there with, like, if I had to say true or false, if I would say it's true or false. I think I'm leaning towards true, but I think it's a good argument.
I think also, Tavo, it'd be interesting if you and I talk about the ontological extension I've been forming too, which I never told you about because you were settled. Just stop sending me versions and let's do the presentation. But
sure, yeah.
But
I actually do have a Jesus Megazord argument that I'm working on.
Oh yeah, that's
yeah.
Cool.
But go ahead, Horus. So what were you saying? So there's evidence of the real world.
I think Simos mentioned this and a few others about facts about humans can inform moral reasoning, right? But this whole conversation.
I don't know that they can. What is a fact about humans?
Well, humans experience pain. Chronic violence undermines trust and well-being. Empathy and cooperation have deep history and social roots and evolutionary, right?
Yeah, but I would just call that.
That's not.
There's no moral code. That's the whole point. Is they don't mechanically produce a moral code. So there's you're sort of.
This is a very different argument. So are you arguing for moral anti-realism? That is a valid position. I'm also agnostic on that position. I think a strong case can be made for, especially if
you're asking me you're asking me personally.
Yeah. You're arguing for moral anti-realism, right? You're saying that all moral decision making is
me personally in my life, I think sort of solar ethics and objective ethics of the observable testable reality that has always been there. We're just sort of discovering it more and more. So that starts with
give me an objective ethical rule that emerges from our study of the human condition.
So truth depends on correspondence with reality, right? So we live in a solar system which is reality centered. Why? Because mistakes and lies and deception can harm humans. We've learned this.
Why is it bad to harm a human?
Because in a world of cooperation and sort of love and peace, sort of these
we harm humans every day, right? I get harmed at least every other week when I pay my taxes.
Well, that's sort of been, I'm just getting to the point of these sort of Romanized, Latinized words and what we call ethics, the virtue ethics of kindness, cooperation, etc. They've always been around, even
they haven't always been around.
Humans.
Many cultures don't.
Well, animals participate in that world as well. They're like baboons and lions are participating with the birds and realizing that this is
actually let me highlight something before you keep going. So, I would put that all in the descriptive phenomenon bucket. Like let's say there's an animal that adapted better legs. The better legs more moral than their previous iteration of legs. I mean, that's just if you're saying that our behavior is on a different evaluative level than any other physical phenomena, then you have to show me where the divide is and why there's a different value.
Are we talking about sort of the observable reality or just the ethical code? Because that's where I think the category error is happening here with sort of projecting personal ethics and morals into the observable reality, even though there is an objective reality, objective ethical standard in our solar system. So I'll ask a few questions, right? Because if we ask the same questions according to like names like Jesus or Yahweh or any of the religious deities, which you haven't even gave credit to, you haven't gave any energy or sort of claims to them. You're just pronouncing to sort of your own version of a god per se, which is just a Greek word, right?
Well, if you're talking about argument 1, then I'm doing personal and impersonal. If you're doing argument 2, then I'm talking about double imputation, which is solely Christian.
Yeah, so we already established.
Here's the question that I have for you, and I'm not hearing an ethical rule that emerges from the physical study of the human body. And if you're saying what is a rule that emerges that is an ethical rule that emerges from our material understanding of what we are?
Like you're talking about virtue ethics, like inside humans.
Any ethical rule you want to come up with. See, here's the problem. People often say things like we shouldn't hurt people, right? But we do hurt people, right? There is suffering, and the question is how do we justify that in some situations, right? So let me finish my point, because I think landing this plane is important for the rest of the conversation. So here's the point. If you're saying we shouldn't hurt people, then you have to say, well, we shouldn't hurt people unless it's necessary, right? And if you're saying that, then clearly there has to be another standard that you're smuggling in, right? So again, you're not giving us an axiomatic moral standard, right?
I think it's just more of the correlation with what we've always known throughout all of cultures, with the connection with knowledge increases the knowing to do good, and light is good and darkness is ignorance.
But those are very vague terms, right? If you're just saying, here's another word for it. Here's another word for being good, which is light. Here's another word for bad, which is darkness, right? That doesn't give us any moral or ethical grounding. It just replaces good and bad.
The whole Persian cosmological system and ethical standard was based on the whole duality system, and so and New Kingdom Egypt as well. So it played a huge important role. And even in Christianity, we have the dualism, right, with God and Satan, which plays a huge role for Christians in their life.
Not dualism.
Whereas in reality, it's not quite looked as that. It's a balance of like the darkness and the setting of the sun is not evil. It's the proper regeneration of the ecosystem and sort of, right, the rules of how it works. And we're a part of that. So we go through that system.
I'm really bad at answering my Discord emails, by the way. Yeah, I mean, but here's the thing: I'm still not hearing any generation of ethics from the material condition, and that was the claim that you started with.
I was sort of ranting off there. I was planning on sticking to the just argument one and sort of going to some other debunks as well here. Some old notes here I'm bringing up because I'm seeing some category errors here. I think you're saying that Christianity is the best ethical standard, whereas that's just simply not the case because there's no foundation.
No, that's a very different claim. I'm not saying that. I'm saying for purposes of this discussion, I'm saying you're saying that morality emerges from material experience, material and scientific understanding, and I'm asking you for an example of a moral rule or ethical rule that emerges from a materialistic understanding of the universe.
Okay, so just like how we correlate light with darkness and love with hate, and that one of the most powerful lessons from the study of the stars and light is that they not only prescribe they don't prescribe moral rules, right? That's the important thing, but they do reveal a universe with stable discoverable regularities. And we know this because of the microscope and the telescope. Without light is what's happening when we look into it. It's not that we're seeing stars, we're seeing what light is capable of providing for us through knowledge. That's what knowledge is. Knowledge is the illumination of the mind. So we don't know the darkness realm outside of, right, the realm we haven't discovered.
So is a brown dwarf evil?
There's a mystery realm beyond, but in the simple reality, we know it's very simple. We live in a solar system with a sun that organizes the system and leads our circadian rhythm and provides food through photosynthesis.
Yeah. I'm curious about this mystery realm from beyond. What is the evidence of the mystery realm from beyond?
If you're asking about sort of my personal ethical standard, I think that the more humans are aligned with that system.
Well, Simos, why don't you chime in? Because I'm happy to talk about what objective ethics was arguing. I think my point is Horus is making a claim. I don't hear the claim being grounded in any real moral grounding.
Well, yours, the divine, I heard Rex say that he doesn't believe in divine command theory, right?
Right.
So at what point, like, what is acceptable, what isn't? How do you decipher what parts of the Bible are not trustworthy, what isn't? I mean, that just leaves confusion, no?
Here's why. Because most atheists rest on divine command theory, and they're not aware of the answer, because usually the Euthyphro dilemma hits on, is it a standard above God, which God must obey, that's morality, or is it a standard that God creates by fiat whenever it's acceptable to him? And the answer is that it's God's character, meaning that which is, I think, the personal source I'm referring to. It's God's internal character that characterizes what morality is in the first place, giving us that moral grounding, giving us that I'm starting to fade a little bit. It takes a lot of energy to talk that fast.
We're at 3 hours too, so we could start moving towards wrapping this up.
But you're also saying that the internal standard of the text. Now, the internal standard you're not obliging to. You're saying that you don't follow divine command theory. Now, that's a lot of the Old Testament is giving specific commands and laws. Are you willing to follow those commands and laws? Are you participating in the Sabbath in that, or no?
Well, if you're hearing what I'm saying, the Euthyphro dilemma hits over God and below God. I'm saying that the standard is within God. So it's not that, because God says things, it's divine command theory. That's not the same thing. Divine command theory is fiat, whereas the things that God says are from him and his character, rather. Now, when you're talking about Old New Testament, I did a debate on slavery back in January. It's on my channel. You can check that out, and where I distinguish moral law and civil law. Obviously, the civil laws we have in a country are not the reflection of absolute moral laws. They're usually concessions to things that we consider wrong that we cannot otherwise contain because society has decided to drift in such a way that we cannot enforce otherwise, so we'll take the best deal we can get, sort of like how prohibition worked in the U.S.
Yeah, because you previously asked me, like, how do I know hurting people is wrong? How do you know those portions of scripture are no longer authoritative or morally acceptable? How do you know that the God of the Bible is not in full effect, just like Jesus says, whoever teaches these laws will be called great in the kingdom? So you should be teaching people to keep those laws that were commanded by Moses, right? So you're sort of.
Have you read the Bible?
I have, yeah.
Have you read Acts chapter 10?
Sorry?
Have you read Acts chapter 10?
Exodus chapter 10?
Acts, the book of Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10?
Yeah, I've read the Bible, yeah.
Okay, so you're aware that when it comes to, and Chris Iverson, who did a book called Divorce Your Marriage and has a channel called Divorce Your Marriage, he's going to be coming out soon with a video on the law and how that works and how the law is not put away. However, it's very complex and you probably won't accept the answer. I just because it's, most atheists don't accept theological answers, to be totally frank. But when you look at Matthew chapter 19, for example, it says Moses gave you divorce for the hardness of your heart. What that's saying is on a civil law level, Moses saw that there would be bad outcomes if he didn't allow for a divorce, not that divorce actually ended a marriage. Because as I even argued in my debate with Unitarians last week with a channel called On Day 3, I brought that up as an example of God saying this is and not the reflection of the moral law. This was a concession in a civil context. And same thing with the ceremonial law of mixing threads and eating pork and all that kind of stuff. That is a reflection, as Galatians says, that is a schoolmaster leading up to the ultimate truth. But now that instead of having a temple that is a centrally located place where people come to be sanctified by the actions of the priest, now Peter says in one of his epistles that we are a royal priesthood. Paul says that our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. Now that with the dwelling of the temple in Holy Spirit, it's not that the old law was taken away, but now that we are in the priesthood, now that we are the temple in of ourselves, having God indwelling, we can eat pork now, not because the old law has gone away in that sense, but because now we sanctify what we eat. So that's why you have Acts chapter 10, where Peter is told, Peter, kill and eat. Not because God was wrong before, but because we're in a different spot spiritually and our nature has changed. And when your nature is changed, the relationship changes between yourself and God. We are now sanctified by the Holy Spirit, whereas before we had a temple, we had sacrifice, we had all that kind of stuff that pointed to God, but wasn't as close a relationship based on the nature that God gives us now.
Yeah, I can.
I would argue
I kind of feel like we're right at
practicality to
I think we're right at 3 hours, so we should probably wrap things up. There are a couple of comments in the chat about I should deal more with the argument that morality emerges from empathy. I'm happy to take a quick question on that if there is one, but we're also at the end of a very long stream, so we could talk about that later.
I do hear what you're saying. I have heard those perspectives before, Rex, and I want to talk with Tavo a little bit more, maybe another day. We have a discussion going on with the many Jesuses, the different versions, maybe in the Bible and outside of it. It's very interesting. We can maybe do that another day, but just for the sake of this discussion, now, how do I know Deuteronomy 13, where it says like if someone comes along and preaches another deity, don't follow them? Because you're saying Acts 10, but Deuteronomy 13 comes before that. Like Acts 10 doesn't trump the Deuteronomy book. This is why the whole Jewish religion is still a force in a way, because they don't acknowledge anything outside of their deity. That's the whole point of their deity. Was the first commandment was idolatry, right? And the whole point of Jesus and he doesn't fulfill any messianic prophecies, and Paul's teachings.
There's a lot of assumptions in this question. I would say
this is a bit of a misnomer. There are many Jews who acknowledge the deity of Jesus, right? There are many Jews who acknowledge the divinity of Jesus. There are many Jews who acknowledge the messiahhood of Jesus, and there are still other Jews that believe that the time for the Messiah has elapsed, and the Messiah never came, and that the Holy Spirit abandoned us, and we have some other conduit. So it's not true to say that there is a single Jewish reconciliation of right now what to do with the problem of Jesus and the influence that Jesus had on Jewish liturgy and theology.
Simos, you're muted.
So is there any?
I would also add that there was several sects of Judaism which were extremely legalistic, and that carried on, right? The Essenes and
the Judaizers after the time of Jesus, yeah.
So and before, and is what I'm saying. I mean, I think there's a long lead into Christianity from Jewish thought before finally we get to Christianity, and I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that's why they refer back to the Old Testament, is because there's a lot of history and thought which has gone into Christianity, which comes directly from that. It's not all Greek.
The centerpiece of Jewish liturgy is the Amidah. Now, that was written by Simon Bar Clopas, who was the son of Clopas, who was one of the two people on the road to Emmaus. He was probably the direct cousin of Jesus, and he was the second leader of the Jerusalem church. So there's a lot of scholarship behind that. Terry Traster is a guy who's formulated a lot of those arguments, and he'll be on the channel coming up fairly soon.
Yeah. Let me just answer as briefly as I can your question from earlier, Tavo, if I may, which is just to say, look, you know, when we talk about evolution, we're talking about a very complex structure of our nervous system developing into the state where consciousness arises, right? So it's not that suddenly, you know, how can you ever get that? Well, we have it. That's how you can get it, right? Has the hard problem of consciousness been solved? No, it hasn't. But then that's never been the argument. There's been a long reason as to why empathy is so important to mammals in general, but especially humans, right? Because we have children which spend a long time outside the womb developing, and if we didn't have empathy, at least a bonding chemical that gave us that empathy.
But there always has to be another standard that you're applying to, right? We are not empathetic to all individuals, and moreover, we don't let empathy become too parochial, which it tends to do in a state of nature, right? So there have to be other standards.
No, there doesn't have to be other standards, right? This can just be one continuation from the very early days when we were still apes, right? Just looking after our children and literally bonding within our tribe.
Well, what I'm saying
is to an extension where we've now become 8 billion people on the planet, and we realize that if we're going to save the planet, we're going to have to do a little more extension of tribalism, and that we can't be tribalistic the way we used to be. That's why things like, you know, for me personally,
the most 2/3 of the population, then we wouldn't have that problem.
Well,
sure. I mean, I guess that's what the Christian nationalists are trying to do, right?
This is the lead into a much longer conversation. I'm happy.
I'm not a Christian nationalist, by the way. I'm just saying that's
I know that.
leaving the argument for a joke. That's all.
I know that. Yeah. I was kind of leading it just to get to that extreme, right?
And my issue is not that
I'm not wrong though. That a certain section of that crowd are.
I'm a critic, Simos. Go ahead.
I understand. Everybody here is.
Yeah.
I'm a critic of Christian nationalism specifically.
Okay, great. Yeah, some of it I am, some of it I'm not.
Go ahead, Tavo.
My issue is not that behaviors that look a lot like moral behavior ought not arrive from purely evolutionary mechanisms. That's not the issue. That's a very different set of contentions, right? The issue here is, can we ground morality? Can we make a determination about an ought existing that ought to come into existence for some specific reason that's grounded in something else externally? Now, you can say that it grounds from empathy, but that leaves gaps in the explanation. There are reasons why we shouldn't be empathetic in some situations, right? Moreover, as a biological mechanism, empathy is often parochial and potentiates sort of in-group and out-group identification, right? So there are limitations to empathy, right? And then there's also issues where empathy can be blunted. So you can't say that morality purely arises from empathy.
No, where does empathy arise from? Right? I explain that.
Well, I'm okay saying empathy is mostly a neurological process.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So we've evolved this particular system or neurological system of chemicals which help us.
Yeah, but so are motor functions.
And that changes. And I'm okay even saying that changes our behavior.
Bonding is an empathy, right?
Yeah, but so are motor functions like blinking and breathing and
absolutely
heartbeat.
Absolutely.
But empathy we see
but they're slightly more
in the Western culture from Christianity. Empathy is not a standard across all cultures throughout history.
Yes,
and
it is.
Here's the real problem. Does empathy give you moral rules by which you should live your life? And I think the answer to that is no.
No, empathy
you have to smuggle in another standard, because there are times when you have to transgress empathy. It's not empathetic to put people into prison.
No, the Jains, right? They transcend anything to do with killing or harming other creatures in general.
Yes, so
hang on, Horus, let me just get a couple of things out, because he's put a few things on the table to what I said there. I'm just squeezing things. So this neurological,
we're at the end of a long stream. So.
Sure, this neurological process, right, which we go through, which we derive our empathy from. Okay, that's there for very good evolutionary reasons, right? Because we've extended the life or the age at which we become adults outside the womb. We've had to do that because of our large heads, etc. Right? So that's important, right? Because babies can't survive on their own. Whereas if you look at most mammals, they give birth and they can just walk away from their young, because they've done all of their internal gestation has given them everything they need to survive. But that's not the case with human beings. So we have to spend a long time, many years, teaching our babies, right, how to act within our society for the good of our society. Now that can break down, absolutely, but it has a neurological system which is backed by dopamines and
well,
there's another word, oxytocin,
but
right?
let's talk about where it does break down, right? We know it breaks down in some situations, right?
Of course it does. Of course it does. It's not perfect.
Therefore, it
evolution is never perfect.
Yeah, which is fine. Therefore, there ought to be, if it is solely your moral grounding, then there has to be another rule.
No, I haven't let me get to the end. All right. The point is.
Well, that's true. I am rushing you, but then again, the
point is that then, right, once we've gone through this process of having our parents teach us about what's correct, right behavior within the family, right, and then later on in the local society, when they send us to school and stuff, and you come home and they go, you've been bullying so and so, you shouldn't do that. This is all correction, right? And a reasoning person is able to take that on board and adjust their behavior. That's where the moral system that you're talking about it really comes into force, because we have language in which we can describe the actions that we should be doing, right, because we're now able to use this language because we think, right, because we can foresee the future, because we can use purpose, right? These things are very important to us as human beings and in our societies.
Look,
okay, so it's not the question. It's not the question that we've suddenly just got. Oh, well, all of a sudden we're born and we've got a moral.
No. No one's
sense.
no one's making that claim. None of us are making that claim.
Because our moral sense is developed over a long period of time.
No. Nor am I making the claim that that God waved a magic wand and endowed us with morals at a specific point in history, right? Nor am I making the claim that somebody can't go through life as an atheist and still come out and be a very moral person. Those are all very, very different claims. The claim is, if I say we ought to be a certain way, okay, what are the ethical rules that determine that ought?
Yeah, I just explained them. Right, you have a moral bonding. You have a moral bonding.
You just showed that there's a good to society that emerges, right? But even a good to society is not ultimately independently good, right? There are situations where human society ought to be curtailed, right? When we encroach on the environment.
There's only one.
Look at how the Japanese treated the Chinese before the Second World War. They enslaved them, right? The assumption that all humans are treated as human just isn't a historical fact. It's a historical.
Moreover, I agree. But look how the Christians treated the African slave trade.
It creates.
Right? It's just not a fact that grounding it in God does any better than grounding it in nature.
One more brief point, and then we should probably wind it down. But one more brief point is you've created an entirely anthropocentric moral code. All right. Well, why don't we stop there?
I mean, again, I don't want to argue whether atheists can have moral grounding, as far as I'm concerned.
No. I agree. None of us have made the claim that atheists cannot have moral grounding. The question is, where does an ought emerge from, right? If you're saying that if you're citing
it's normative. Listen to David Hume.
No, I understand David Hume's argument, but here's the problem. David Hume would contend that you can't get an ought out of that. You would admit that.
No.
Right? So,
not at all.
Because the is-ought dilemma.
He then goes on to describe one, right? He just thinks that vulgar religious justifications can't do it either, right?
Oh, I'm aware that he doesn't.
He was unaware of evolution, right? He was unaware of the complex process that we've gone through to devolve consciousness.
But none of that is moral. None of that is moral.
That's why it doesn't. That's why it's not absolute. If you're saying that you need absolute morals, then no, I disagree.
That's absolutely wrong.
Yeah, that's fine.
We do not have it. I know it's wrong, but
like I said, I'm agnostic on the point of, I was probably an ethical emotivist for a lot of my life. I think ethical emotivism has been fairly soundly disproven, right? but there,
Oh,
it's been replaced with a similar doctrine, which is ethical moralistic quasi realism, and I'm sort of in that camp. But again, that doesn't give you any objective rules for morality.
No, you have to think about them. You have to use empathy and reason, which is exactly the same justification that I'm giving, right? That comes from evolution.
But you're just saying you should use reason. You're supplanting moral thinking with reason, right? And so you're just using a different word for it.
No,
you're not giving me a moral rule.
No, but that's because I can't, right? Because it depends what your reason is, right? If you think that if you're a sociopath, right, and you don't think any of this counts, right, then according to me, you're not going to be moral. Does that mean they can't be moral? Well, if they follow their nature, they will.
Yeah, but
why? For the same reason, for the same reason objective ethics said, because we're not talking about people who are in the middle. We're not talking about an average person anymore. We're talking about an extreme. And we've come from this creature that had no morals, admittedly, right? But because we're sophisticated, reasoning, thinking humans, because we've developed language to the degree we have, because we have some foresight about the future, we use axiological explanations. And in doing that, we are inheriting.
So we have objectively superior criteria of evaluation.
Effectively, but we have a language. We have a language. We have a language which we can use to describe these things.
I really am kind of pretty close to my hard stopping point, and we're at 3 hours and 15 minutes.
Anyway, look, that's kind of the atheist argument for it.
Right? Let's let him land the owl plane. Let's let him land the owl plane.
Let's pick this up. We'll have another conversation about it. I'm not convinced that there are moral rules that are universal, that are objective, that are universal.
Nobody's saying they are from the atheist perspective.
No, I understand. That's where the consensus lands.
Whenever I hear that, I just think you're smuggling God in. So
no, I'm not smuggling God in. Like I said, I'm personally agnostic on the question.
Did you hear my response, Tavo, to what your question was, or no? This can be explained pretty simply.
Okay, that's fine. I really do have to get the door.
We got to do a hard stop.
Let me do that.
Okay, this is.
All right, let me do that. I'll turn it over to ReEx. You can manage the stream for a second, and I'll be right back. I do want to close things down, but
so
yeah, I do have to get the door.
Right,
hold on, Horus. I do have to. There is somebody waiting for me at the door, so
okay.
Yeah. Hold on.
You all in which case, I'll just say my goodbyes. I think it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Simos.
I did, I wrote down quite a few objections as you were going through in the side chat, but obviously I didn't expect you to read them, of course. And
I'm not dude. With all I had to say, I wasn't going to read the side chat. I was way too mentally busy.
Well, you also missed the important bit for me. Which was argument 3, because that's where I have my main concerns. Like I only got to argument 1 before I thought, hang on a minute. Argument 3 was ontological extension. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So yeah.
But anyway, we'll do that another day because there's too much already. But as I said, I think that there's philosophically there's a few issues going on here, and I think you're going to have to raise the game to get over them. I sent you a DM asking for you to give me the P1 and P2 at least.
Yes, I saw that
for that first argument. Great.
I'm looking for where I'm at because I have long.
Do it tomorrow. Do it tomorrow because I'm not going to get to it anytime soon.
All right, I am back. If you want to. Horus, if you want to say what you meant to say quickly.
I will look at it.
Let's hear Horus, please.
Yeah, let's hear Horus really quickly, and then we'll close things down.
So as we probably heard of ancient Egypt, right? The greatest civilization, biggest civilization to this day, tens of thousands of years of documented history, artographs, and all that. So we know the sun has always been used as a sort of objective symbol of light and illumination and order and harmony. That's what the whole utterance of Ma'at and things. When you get into the hieroglyphs, it's quite simple and logical. But right, but the sun doesn't teach ethics in a literal sense, as we know, right? It demonstrates order and continuity. Sort of this resurrection, the energy exchange, right? Humans only use 1/8,000th of what we're capable of using in today's day. We're still in several hundred years we'll be using a lot more because it's providing a lot more than we're currently using, right? So, and we're also dependent on this source of energy for life in the physical conditions, and as I mentioned, circadian rhythm and photosynthesis, and that. So we're discovering more, right? So just projecting an invisible mind, invisible intentions and commands and decrees, it's just a presupposition that doesn't solve anything. Whereas in an observable reality, we have photons, atoms, stars, and biology and chemistry and evolution in that. So it can be investigated. Now, in the sense of where does it actually come from? See, the sun, there's a chain here, and it's quite difficult to see until we should be teaching children this knowledge, but we kind of do, but in a more complicated way. It's quite simple actually, because the sun is what gives us what we call electromagnetic radiation, and then through that we get photons, as we know. They come down to the Earth, and through that they hit our eyes. Right. That's
not where photons come from.
Yeah, photons come from the sun and the light. So then we get molecular change in our eyes
not
and our
from electromagnetic radiation.
So light is the only reason that you know and see anything in your observable and testable reality. It brings us brightness.
Okay, well let's let Horus land the plane.
This whole sort of scientific problem of what we call hard consciousness, which is still up for discussion in our world. But then you get into conscientiousness. Without consciousness and the awareness of light and alignment with the stars and the cycle, just like animals do, you can't increase conscientiousness and empathy and compassion. And that's where the world ends. It just becomes a place of unity and peace in alignment with the solar order in a solar system. There's no argument. The solar system is where we live, right? It's a testable, observable reality. So
sure. I guess
we always use that as a symbol throughout all the art, and you see the halos.
Well, I appreciate you pointing that out. Let's continue this conversation. Again, I go live every Monday, 5 p.m. My homework that I'm giving to all of you, I have 3 pieces of homework for you. Number 1, if you're watching this stream later, please feel free to comment, "Happy birthday, Janice." Janice is a very beloved member of our community and is 95 years old today. It's a really big milestone. Number 2, please stop what you're doing right now and subscribe to ReEx. He's got a fantastic channel. He deserves a much larger audience. Number 3, if you're watching the conversation later, please, and if you want me to tag you in the description, please just let me know. Just comment on the video and let me know what your YouTube channel is. And finally, Robin Webster is a very beloved member of the community who will be doing her celebratory Friday live stream for just crossing over 500 subscribers. So please support Robin's channel. She'll be live streaming Friday, 7 o'clock Central Time, I think. And we are at 1,010 subs right now. So I just crossed over 1,000 subs yesterday. So I'm really very pleased with that. I would love to get more involved with all the people who are in the chat, and I hope you all continue to follow us along on our journey. If you're not already subscribed, please do so. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream, but you've all been really wonderful. It's been a really enriching conversation, and I hope that you all have a really wonderful evening.
Just quickly too, Tavo,